Good morning, everybody. We have a nice attendance present here, and I believe we also have participants via Zoom. So I'll be opening the policy meeting this morning. We're going to pick up where we left off from yesterday afternoon with Mark Bergstrom reviewing the proposals for the 8th edition of the sentencing guidelines. And we talked about a couple of things yesterday that we have some answers to, so I think we're going to get those clarified and then move forward. And we are going to be wrapped up hopefully by a little before 11 and then take a break before the official meeting. So, Executive Director.
Thank you, Judge, and good morning, everyone. Yesterday afternoon was long and tedious and painful in terms of trying to go through and look at the assignments of OGSs. And let me just sort of back up a little bit and explain why we did that. And part of it is that we've spent a number of years now, and the commission has spent a number of years trying to come up with general concepts and policies to guide everything that we're doing. And then staff takes that as sort of directions in terms of trying to implement it. And one of the areas that is very tedious and difficult is when we have thousands of offenses trying to make sure that, you know, with fidelity, we are sort of applying the rules. And so what we try to do is do that, provide it in advance to members, and then during a public meeting, try to explain some of the highlights of those assignments. But it doesn't make it any less painful. But the reason we do that is to first make sure we're on the right track so that we can have a course correction if necessary. To make sure there aren't any surprises so that we point out everything and maybe we highlight some things that we're not sure about in terms of do we need a refinement of a policy. So yesterday, I want to point to 2 or 3 things that we discussed that sort of fall into that category. So the first was we talked about certain offenses where, like with human trafficking or other things like that, where based on either related behaviors or second and subsequent things like that, you might end up with a super felony, an offense that starts as something at or less than a felony 1 with a statutory max of 20 years and is increased to a felony 1 that has a max greater than that. And sometimes that greater max is 40 years, but sometimes it's life. And it sometimes allows for a life sentence, a mandatory minimum and maximum of life. So staff was sort of unclear what type of general assignment we would have for that, especially when there's an enhancement. Because under sort of the rules we had in place and trying to apply what the current guidelines prescribe to these new guidelines or proposed guidelines, the recommendation would have fallen far short of what we generally have as an assignment for a super felony. So that was just one example of trying to get some guidance from the commission about how do you deal with that kind of situation where maybe the an OGS of 20 or 22 or 24 would sort of typically make sense in using the current guidelines. But under the new policy we've talked about, it might go up to the omnibus score for felony 1, super felonies, or up to that top category that we have that's sort of limited to those felonies with a max of greater than 20 years. So again, we just wanted to point that out. What we're trying to do is work towards staff being able to prepare a draft of the guidelines for your review in December. And so where we have these kind of questions about policy or implementation, we're just trying to bring them to your attention. And then, as I said, we also want to make sure there aren't any surprises. So if we just see things that don't look quite right, we wanted to bring it to your attention so that then in December, when we're discussing it, you've had some time to think about it. And a good example of that are the enhancements, where we said, we're trying to build in all of these requirements of the enhancement. In some cases, it's required by statute. But sometimes it starts to look disproportionate, that there's 6 or 7 or 8 different factors that we're taking into account with the enhancement. And if you add a point or two for each, all of a sudden it becomes this really, large sentence recommendation that seems sort of outscale. And so that's where we're looking at it and saying, should there be some type of cap in terms of, the sort of the upper limit for how much the enhancement changes the base recommendation. So again, we're not looking for answers, but we're trying to highlight these so that when staff comes up with a draft for you to review in December, that we can sort of return to this and say, does this work for you, or is there something you prefer us to do? And certainly between now and then, if there's any issues that we've covered or that come to your attention that you want to pass on to us, we'll incorporate that into the draft, and then all the members will be able to review it in December. So that's just, I just wanted to sort of return to that and just sort of frame things, because yesterday was, at least for me, it was painful, and so I'm sure for you it was painful as well. Let me just mention one other thing, because we talked about specific assignments for DUI, and I just wanted to return to that to hopefully give maybe a better or clearer explanation of the process. Our guidelines address minimum terms of confinement. So all of our recommendations about confinement are about the minimum term. And if you look at the DUI statute and all the mandatories and all the complications of the DUI statute, including the most recent changes, there's a blending of mandatory minimums and classification of crimes, grades of offenses. And in the past, we were just using the grade of the offense to come up with the default assignment for the OGS. But if you think about it, that's about the maximum term. It's not about the minimum term. And everything else in the guidelines is about minimum terms. So that's why we're sort of flipping the approach. We're saying, let's use the mandatory minimum to designate that minimum, that OGS assignment. And then let's use the grade of the offense as sort of an override to increase the OGS assignment when you run out of real estate, or when, the General Assembly has indicated, oh, this is more, notwithstanding what the mandatory minimum is. So I don't think either way is going to be perfect, and there's always going to be sort of these overrides, but I think the approach of going with the mandatory as the sort of the primary driver in the assignment under this new complicated system, I think makes more sense, because it'll be more of an appropriate fit to start with. And then using the grade as the override allows it to be increased. So again, that's the logic. We can rebuild that if you think we should, but we will continue on this track, build that into the proposal we give you in December. But again, if you have any suggestions, let us know. So with that, we're going to move from the discussion of OGS to other factors in the guidelines and the proposed sentencing guidelines. The first document I'm going to ask Ryan to share, and we're going to try to make sure when we're sharing the screen that we can continue to see who's online, because that was sort of difficult yesterday. So we're going to share the screen, but retain either the participant list or the photos of people on the side. So the document that I'd like to share is the big listing of all of the offenses. So the title is Sentencing Guidelines Proposals, Proposed OGS Prior Rec Score Assignments. And it was a mere 37 pages. So I'm sure you all viewed this carefully, but so this is where we took all of the other changes we were proposing or suggestions we had about reassignments and so forth, and we plugged them into a single document. And we probably went overboard with this document. We tried to make sure, this is just the crimes code, but we wanted to make sure that we included just about every offense we could find in the crimes code. Now, in terms of eventually publishing this and having it as part of the guidelines, we're going to find that there's chapters in Title 18 where the offenses are rarely reported to the commission. There's very few conviction offenses for those. And the default that we have is the OGS assignment. And you're going to find a lot of those offenses listed here, where we're basically recommending as the OGS assignment, the omnibus score. And so in a practical sense, when we finally like publish guidelines, I'm not sure that you need pages and pages of offenses, that the default is just the omnibus score, that the commission hasn't done any special assignment. They've just sort of agreed to the omnibus, because we know the omnibus is the fallback. If an offense isn't otherwise listed, you use the omnibus. So I just mentioned that we wanted to give you all the details that you knew what the assignments were. But I think staff will go through and identify chapters where everything is an OGS, is an omnibus assignment. And maybe instead of providing all the details of that, we'll just list the chapter and indicate the omnibus score applies. Because that might just be simpler for everyone to see and work with. And there's also titles of purgings where we get very few offenses and everything falls under the omnibus score, like game violations, things like that there's reported offenses, but they're all omnibus score. So probably no need in detailing all of that. So just as a general approach, that's what we're thinking of as we bring stuff to you in December. So in this big document, what's new and different from the last meeting was we added the revised working draft OGS assignments. And special categories and so forth, but we had in effect 36 that deal with typical offenses, and now we have 30. So to some degree, in some of these areas, there's just going to be a 6-point discount. But we also we did other alignment. We combined some things and we expanded some ranges and stuff like that. And so this new listing just takes into account what was sort of the best fit as compared to what we published in January. So that's the first thing that you'll see. The OGS assignments take into account that recalibration and then the changes we discussed yesterday. The second column, the one to the far right, is prior rec score values. And this gets to this whole new approach to prior record score. And we wanted to find a sort of streamlined and easy way to explain prior record score. And so I hope this does it, but let me sort of go through the explanation. Under the current prior record score policy, what the court's required to know, or whoever's preparing the guidelines is required to know, is for any conviction prior to the date of the offense, the approach is that you look at each of the judicial proceedings, or each of the criminal incidents, I guess, in which a person was convicted of prior offenses. And the lead offense of the judicial proceeding is considered in the prior record score. You figure out the point value of that, and that's included in the prior record score. And then you take into account any consecutive sentence. And for each of those offenses, those are included in the prior record score. And then we have a list of offenses, and we say, and it's linked to the OGS, but we say these offenses are worth 4 points, and these 3, and these 2, and these 1. And then some of these are less than 1, and you have to sort of add them up, and then you cap at 7 and so forth. So it's pretty complicated in figuring out the prior record score. But that's the approach we have right now. And so as the commission's talked about simplifying and streamlining the prior record score process, the approach that we've discussed was, and what we published in January was, that you look at all prior convictions, any conviction prior to the date of the current offense. You identify the most serious offense, and then you determine how many other priors have that same level, that same grade or same level of seriousness. And so you end up with a very sort of much more simplistic approach. Just look at all prior convictions, identify the most serious, and then is there one of those or is there more than one of those? Judge?
So Mark, you're looking at if somebody has one incident and they've got 5 convictions, are you looking at all 5 of those?
We
now?
are. We
Not
are.
just the lead offense.
Right, not just lead offense. And one of the reasons to sort of take this approach, and we've talked about this before, is the processing of cases from county to county and almost municipality to municipality varies. So in some counties, there's sort of a consolidation of things and you just focus on the lead offense. And in some counties, every offense is charged and you get a conviction for everyone. And we've tried a number of different ways to try to accommodate all that. And there's just not an easy way to do that. And then we, one of the accommodations was let's build in this concurrent consecutive thing. And that didn't really help either. And so we've sort of gone back to saying, let's just look at what all the conviction offenses are. And then let's have a streamlined way of counting them. Because even if they're in the same incident, you might have multiple victims, you might have, there might be in a judicial proceeding, there might be multiple incidents, right? And so it's just, there's no easy way. And so if we're going to try to automate this and simplify it, let's just look at every conviction offense. Let's figure out what the most serious thing is, because that's an important factor. And then let's figure out how many of those there were. And so that's the, there's pluses and minuses, but that's how judges can aggravate, mitigate, or depart, right? But as a general policy, that would be the approach. So when we took that to public hearings, I think, there was some, I think, support for the simplification and automation of that. One of the concerns was the categories we came up with seemed to, there were concerns that some offenses were left out. They were treated less serious than they should have been. So what we're proposing here, and this takes into account what we heard in public hearings, is there's in effect 4 categories of offenses. So the first and most serious category is crimes of violence. So defined in 9714G. But if you look at that definition doesn't include murder 1 or murder 2. So we add that into the mix, right? So it's criminal homicide, or at least murders, and then any other crime of violence. And that includes inchoates to that. So that is the first category and the most serious category. The second category we originally said were felony 1s and felony 2s. But when we had the public hearings, and particularly from the AG's office and many of the DAs, there was a concern that there are some really serious felony 3s and even M1s that we should be treating more seriously, maybe treating similar to F1s and F2s. And the 3 categories they targeted were Article B, so the offenses against persons, so assaults and rape, things like that. Megan's Law offenses and violations of the Uniform Firearms Act. So those 3 categories would be, we should be looking at those and thinking about identifying F1s or even, F3s or even M1s that we sort of bump up into the F1 and F2 category. And so that's exactly what we did. We went through the whole list, and for those 3 categories, Article B, Megan's Law, and VUFA, we identified all F3s and M1s, and we treat those as F1s and F2s. So they come up into the second category. So we have crimes of violence and murder, F1s, F2s, and then F3s and M1s if they're in those chapters of Title 18. And then the other 2 categories are all other felonies and all other misdemeanors. So we come up with 4 categories of offenses. And then the prior record score just links to that. So again, taking that rule where we just look back at all prior convictions, identify if there's 1 or more than 1 of those, then how do we apply that to our matrix, to our categories 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4? Well, that's what we have on this column where it has prior record score values. So for a crime of violence, so if you look down through the list, and I think on page 2, Ryan, if you page down on page 2, you'll find some COVs. So these are in the crimes of violence category. Yeah, just paging down to the next page. Yeah. So if you see the COVs there, like murder 3 and so forth, that would be a crime of violence. If you look over to the right-hand column, you'll see the notation is 344. That means for a first prior of murder 3 or anything equivalent to that, so anything in that top tier of a crime of violence, you would be in prior record score 3 category. And for a second or subsequent, so second, third, or any other one, you'd be in 4. And 4 is revoc. So if you look, and I know it's hard to shuffle all these various things, but in the matrix, we have 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the prior record score categories. So this means if you have any prior crime of violence, the first prior record score category you're landed is 3. And if you have 2 or more, you're at 4. So that's somewhat consistent with our current policy in terms of revoc is reserved for someone with 2 prior crimes of violence and a current crime of violence, sort of a 3 strikes rule. But this expands on this because this says anyone, you don't have to have a current crime of violence. Anyone with 1 prior crime of violence is a 3, and 2 or more prior crimes of violence is a 4, which is revoc. And revoc allows the statutory limit. So that's I think that's a response to concerns about repeated violent offenders, pattern behavior, and about adjustments that we're making to the prior record score to reduce the impact of prior record score, but recognizing crimes of violence and murder as priors are different and categorically are treated differently. So that's the first category. That's so 3, 4, 4. First prior of that puts you in prior record score 3 category. Any subsequent caps you at 4. If we move to the second category, then the second. Oh, sure. Yep.
So if somebody has 2 aggravated assaults out of 1 incident, so they serious bodily injury to 2 people in 1 incident, they are convicted of both. For prior record score purposes, is that a 3 or is that
No,
4?
we look at all individual offenses, all convictions.
So if
That would
somebody
move
had
you to
1
4.
incident. Okay. The only reason I asked that is I guess that could have happened when people were sentenced to 4, but I've got the idea of revoc is somebody who's done it once and now they've done it again. So I was just curious how that.
Yeah, this runs this. You're right. I mean, for 3 strikes, you're right. That's the definition of 3 strikes. For prior record score, again, these are voluntary or advisory guidelines, and we're just setting a stage, and we're saying that's for the typical case. And the typical would be that there would be multiple incidences, but maybe that's not typical, and the court could depart from the guidelines or mitigate. Keep in mind that the lower end of revoc is still lower than it used to be, right? So we're still but what it does is it includes the statutory limit as revoc always did.
Well, and also I'm going to say that it doesn't seem like you should get a discount because you happen to commit. So the
Right.
fact that they took 2 victims in 1 incident, I just wanted to clarify to make sure I was understanding the calculation. So thank you.
Sure, thank you. So that was the first category of prior offense, crimes of violence.
I apologize for interrupting. Do you mind if I ask a question real quick?
Oh, please, sure.
Mark, so just sort of foundationally here, has there been any material changes in the proposed 8th edition guidelines since the special work session on July 28th?
Yes, exactly what we're talking about right now.
Okay.
So the key here is that I think in the proposal that was published in January, there was no carve out for these three categories for crimes against persons. So Article B for VUFA or for Megan's Law. There was no carve out for that. They were treated. We just looked at the grade of the offense, basically. The feedback during the public hearing was we should think differently about those three categories. And I think when we had discussions on July 28th, we did not have the policy developed then. We just agreed that we would treat offenses in those three sections differently. But I don't think we described it as applying that to F3s and M1s, because you could have taken those discussions as saying apply it to any offense under that, and that would mean M3s would be treated like F1s. So I think as we were looking through this and looking back at the testimony, the idea was there are M1s and F3s that sort of should be treated much more seriously, and we should put those in with those serious felonies. And so again, I think that is different, qualitatively different than either what we published in January or what we discussed more generally in July. So that's why we're spending some time like focusing on how these definitions would work and how they would play out.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Good, thank you. So that's the top category, crimes of violence. So now the second category, F1s, F2s, and then F3s or M1s if they're in those three categories: crimes against persons, Megan's Law, VUFA. So if you look at the category, the next category we have, and Ryan, maybe you could go to the next page. And under voluntary manslaughter, I think there's some examples there of F1 offenses that are not VUFA, are not crimes of violence. And you'll see there that the category is 233. So basically any F1 offense that's not a crime of violence should be in the 233 category. You can see some of them right there. So the idea here is, again, if you look at the matrix, if you have a conviction for that offense or any equivalent offense to that, your prior record score for the first one is a prior record score 2. And for a third or subsequent prior of that level, it would be prior record score 3. So you would not move to 4. 4 is reserved for crimes of violence, but you would move to 3 with 2 prior convictions for an F1, F2, or those designated F3s, M1s. So that's the second category. And you can just think about that with any felony 1 or felony 2, and then add in these extra, these special F3s and M1s in terms of the starting point for the prior record score is 2, and then it moves to 3 for a second or subsequent. Moving to the third category, we've excluded basically the violent and serious felonies because we put them in either crimes of violence or that second category we just described. So now every other felony that's left is in the third category. And so if we look down at felony 3s that are not in those categories, and we might have to move back a couple pages, but if we get to a felony 3 like for theft, a felony 3 for theft would be 223. So for one prior felony 3, you would receive a prior record score of 2. For a second prior for that level of offense, you'd also be in 2. And for a third or subsequent prior, you'd move to 3. So that's for any other felony, and that would include drug felonies. And then the fourth category, the final category, would be any misdemeanor. So we exclude the M1s that went into that second category, but any other misdemeanor would be in the final category. And you'll see, a bunch of these for misdemeanors. And this would be 1, 1, 2. So any prior misdemeanor gives you a 1 in the prior record score. A second prior misdemeanor keeps you at 1. A third or subsequent prior misdemeanor puts you at 2, and you're capped at 2. So it's we can automate the process. We base it on all convictions prior to the current offense date. We don't have to worry about concurrent consecutive. We don't have to worry about the grouping of offenses. We don't have to worry about any of that stuff. And for out-of-state offenses, we can apply the same rules because we know what the maximum penalties are based on the grade. It might take a little extra work to figure out current equivalent for an out-of-state offense if it's a crime of violence or if it's in one of these chapters, but people do that now. So out-of-state offenses are always a little bit more difficult, but we have a method to do it. But I think this simplifies it. I think it's much more proportionate. And what we found from the research, and Matt and Brett have done work on this as well, what the research finds is the biggest difference in prior record scores between 0 and anything. And so the idea of having a 0 prior record score that's a true 0 is something we heard about for years. And the research actually supports that having no priors is meaningful as opposed to having any priors. So putting someone with even 1 prior misdemeanor in a 1 category is consistent with the research. And remember, and this is quibbling a bit, but if you get ARD, it doesn't count in the prior record score. So there's that sort of avoidance there. And we will talk later about the lapsing policy. So over some period of time, there are certain offenses that may go away and maybe misdemeanors would. So although we talk about it as being a pure 0, like an asterisk by it because ARD doesn't count and there may be some lapsing of offenses, 10 years out or something like that. So anyhow, so this is, I wanted to give you that. And I think the advance here is, of course, we've made some policy choices as recommendations to you, but I think, this gets to simplifying it. I know I had to go through the explanation of that, but I think just with that being, if you just look back at all priors and you look at the grade of the offense and what the OGS, the prior record score assignment is just based on that 223 or 112, seems to me it's pretty straightforward. And so that was, we're hoping that we're checking the boxes on what we said were guiding principles. Automate it, simplify it, make sure it's consistent with sort of the research in terms of what works and how it works, and just that it can be understandable to the field. So anyhow, so let me pause there, take any questions or comments.
What conviction and sentence for current?
No,
offense?
just convictions. And that's one of the problems right now, because our policy is so complicated and it depends on concurrent consecutive. Right now, under the policy, you can only consider in the prior record score offenses for which you have a sentence because you don't know if it's concurrent or consecutive. So we have that carve out, I think, in our language right now. So this eliminates that. We don't have to know about sentence, which is actually consistent with our definition in the guidelines, which is what the priors you can consider are any convictions prior to the commission of the offense. But then with our prior record score policy, we need a sentence so that we know if it counts or not. So
what we talked about is the commission and conviction before the commission of the current offense, and then a sentence for that prior commission before the sentence on the current conviction. Because
right.
you have those moments in time where individuals are, timing if they're offending or processing of the cases really close and they're not sentenced yet on this one. It'll be a week after you sentence them on the current one. You can't. So anyway, point I think well taken is complicated.
And Judge, I remember many discussions with you about this stuff is getting so complicated.
Yeah.
It's like
I like the simplification.
right. Yeah. So So we think, I mean, we think this is simplification, but we think it's principle too. We think it's tied to what we heard about, what should matter with criminal history and how you treat it and weights. And what we heard was, criminal history should matter when there's, threat to the community, like violence and harm. And I think this tries to capture what we heard during public testimony about, treating those things more seriously and not just looking at the grade of the offense, taking into account the act that occurred. Any other?
So first of all, thank you, because maybe it's just me where the light bulb kind of went off. That becomes much more clear now as I go across and look at all of these. And my question would be, if we're looking at individual offenses and we see assignments and we think that sort of doesn't make sense, or I would bump that up, do we just go through the list before December and reach out to you, or?
Sure. You can do it that way. And what we can, I think we provide, or we can provide sort of those rules, those definitions for the 4 categories. So I think where we found that maybe it's you could get into a lot of tedious kind of work is looking at like Article B, which covers a lot of offenses, a lot of chapters of statute. And you might look at that and say, well, this specific M1 maybe shouldn't be included. But that then takes us towards this very complicated way of coming up with specific assignments for each and every offense. And then it's very difficult. It's not impossible, but it's more difficult to automate that. So trying to come up with categorical approaches to this, and then building into the language of the guidelines as we do now, the authority for the court to recognize when it underestimates or overestimates the criminal history of the defendant. Like right now, we say that, if someone caps out because they have, 7 or more misdemeanors and they cap out at 3 in the prior record score, we say to the court, yeah, if the person has 1,000 prior misdemeanors, you can depart above the guidelines. And if someone has priors, but they're very, very old, what we're thinking about in terms of lapsing, we say to the court, that's the guidelines, but you can depart below the guidelines because you're recognizing it doesn't have the weight that typical cases would. So I'd ask you to, when you're thinking about or looking at these, just think about categorical approaches. So if there were ways that we would define categorically things like take out chapters or something like that, but we need to keep it manageable and sort of streamlined. So that would be the only suggestion or hope, I guess. Any other comments or questions on the prior record score, at least that part of it? Okay, so you have a big list there, and it could be a bigger list, I'm sure, but I wanted to make sure you had that. Okay, let me move on to a couple of other things that are in the prior record score or in the materials. So the next thing is the matrix. And I know Jadine just handed out copies of the matrix. And so I will, I'll talk about a couple of the things with this matrix. And I think under the copy that was emailed to you and that's handed out, there's I think one or two noticeable differences. So the first thing is, under the matrix that was discussed during the July meeting, if you look at OGS 1, prior record score 4, or REVOC, that was, in the earlier version, was still considered level A, restorative sanctions, with, I believe it was RS to 6, with 1 month of restorative condition or restrictive conditions available. What we've done is add that to level B and make it a 12-month of probation. And that was in recognition of people saying, even for an OGS 1, at some point, you should be able to order, probation as a standard thing, and maybe should be presumptively a probation, not allow for guilt without further penalty. So this just sort of takes into account that one category and dropping it down. I think the other thing, and this is something for the commission to consider, but Ryan and I have done a couple of regional meetings, and we purposely did the first couple of them in more rural areas of the state where individuals might not have been involved in these discussions. So we did one in Jefferson County that had people from maybe 3 or 4 surrounding counties, the administrative unit. So we had discussions there. And then we did one in Washington County, a little larger group, but again, sort of a regional meeting there. And a lot of good discussion and feedback. And one of the things that we heard, especially from more rural counties, was some concerns about level A, about the idea that they might not have, like, it might be difficult to order community service or fines or something like that without any kind of supervision. They don't have a standalone community service thing, or, they just can't like plug someone down and hope the work's done, that they need like a little bit more assistance there. And we talked about, how could you strike a balance on this? Because clearly there's some of these offenses that in more urban areas, there is the interest, we heard it in Philadelphia about the interest of trying to have some of these like standalone sanctions like community service or fines or whatever, and just to deal with big numbers of relatively minor offenses. And we talked about this yesterday, sort of akin to MDJs handling these matters. And so we didn't want to lose the ability to target lower level cases to an A where there could be those standalone options without supervision. But we also recognize that, in rural counties, that could be a challenge. So how do you strike a balance there? Well, what we're suggesting is the recommendation should stay that these are non-probation sentences, but we should provide some latitude to the court in terms of a mitigated sentence or an aggravated sentence to add in short periods of probation. And so what we suggested before, for aggravated mitigated, we had plus or minus 25 hours of community service as the sort of adjustment. But we've replaced that with 3 months of probation, so that in those cells where we're recommending up to 6 months of probation as possible, that could be reduced down to 3 months. But in those cells that are just RS, as needed, the court could add up to 3 months of probation. And because the aggravated and mitigated ranges are considered part of the guidelines rather than departure, it can be part of the sort of process of the county that could be, I think, could be easily implemented, and could be part of negotiated pleas, because that was the other thing that they were saying. There's a lot of these negotiated pleas, and they want to stay within the guidelines for a negotiated plea. We think this accommodates that. It might not be perfect. They might want more, but Philly would want less. And so, we just have to sort of figure it out. But we think those two things would accommodate. We add in the 1-4 for level B for probation as sort of a presumptive cell. And then we add in the 3 months of aggravated mitigated time for level A. So I think those were the only 2 changes, Ryan. Were there any other? Okay. So with that, then we have this matrix that takes into account 30 instead of 36 typical categories for assignments. We have, I think we've held to, pretty much what we talked about before in terms of, I think as compared to what we published in January, we have just a little bit broader ranges. I think they're a little bit more proportional. In July, we talked about compressing a couple of things, like for probation, we removed the 30 and 36 month probation cells, and we capped it sort of at 24 months. That was a recommendation from the County Chiefs Association. It doesn't mean courts can't give longer probation, but it sort of targets on those shorter periods that are consistent with some of the research. In some of the county jail sentences, we again collapsed some of those and expanded the range a little bit. I think Judge Marsco and others talked about giving a little bit more discretion within the recommended ranges. And then, as I said yesterday, we have as the F1 omnibus default 22, OGS 22, so a 60-month base for that. And then we have as the super felony, the max of greater than 20 months, 20 years at level F, 27, the 90-month baseline. And so one thing that we were thinking about was in terms of going back and rules that we would apply to bring back to you in December. I think felony 1, super felonies would have a statutory max of greater than 20 years, but not life. Maybe our default would be the 22. And then those offenses that have a statutory max of life, we would have as the default 27 to put it in that category. It's, and again, 27 we want to reserve for those that are super felonies, but that doesn't mean every super felony has to be there. So at least in terms of us plotting all this out to give you a draft to look at, those are some rules that we thought we could apply that provide some proportionality, taking into account the rules we already have in place. So with that, let me take a break, see if there's any questions on that before we move to some final issues. Sure.
So question on, for example, we're in B.
Mhm.
So let's just slide over to, if your OGS is a 4
Mhm.
and your record score is a 2.
Yep.
So we've got 18 months probation, and it says 1 and 2 months restricted condition.
That's right.
So when I'm sentencing that, then I looked up to another example in, let's just say in D.
Mhm.
So like, if OGS is 13,
Mhm.
and we go over the same, our record score, so we have 20 to 26 months restricted conditions.
Mhm.
So my understanding is, when you say 1 to 2 months of restrictive conditions, are you saying that the guideline range would be probation with restorative sanction or with restrictive conditions for 18 months, the first 1 to 2 months of which you impose something like an electronic monitor? Because my understanding is I can't give, it wouldn't be 18 months of probation, 2 months of which is restrictive conditions. I mean, my understanding of how we had to change the language when we went away from CIP is I can give somebody county probation and I can give them conditions, but I can also give probation with restrictive conditions, and we articulate what those are because there's a set definition of what restrictive conditions constitute. So I'm just trying to say for when I am putting this to a sentence on record, what is the difference in terms of how that looks? The recommendation of whatever 20 to 26 months restricted conditions versus 18 months probation with 1 to 2 months of restricted conditions.
Okay, I'm going to start and then I'm going to ask Ryan to talk about this. So I think in the first one at level B, where we're talking about a 18-month probation recommendation with 1 to 2 months of restorative conditions. The technical, the language used to do that, I'm going to defer to Ryan on. But I think the concept is similar to CIP, that it was 18 months of probation is the recommendation, of which 2 months of that probation would include restrictive conditions. So whether that under the new formula would require a 16-month probation with standard conditions and 2 months of probation with restrictive conditions, or it's 18 months of probation with 2 months of house arrest or whatever else. I think the latter is what it is. I don't want to get hyper technical, but that's, and Ryan, please.
Sure.
Is that your understanding?
18 months, and then you articulate the period of the restricted conditions. So it'd be a recommendation from the commission to say, if you judge wish to include restrictive conditions, the recommendation would be 1 up to 2 months of that period of probation.
Okay, so would my sentence, because my current forms, based upon all I learned here, indicate there is a check mark for probation and there's a check mark with probation with restricted conditions. So in the B, am I check marking, if I wanted to impose, let's say my imposition is inpatient treatment or let's say it's just electronic monitor, that's easier. So if I'm following these guidelines, I would say 16 months probation and then check mark, or it's 18 months probation with restricted condition the first 2 months. So then when I go up to number 13 and I have 20 to 26 months, I'm going to sentence, let's say at the bottom of the standard. So I'm 20 months probation with restricted conditions. I impose my restricted conditions, but that may be some section of electronic monitor and then some other things. So
So I think, and Mark can jump in with me on this, and this goes back to like old, like in the 90s CIP and these trade-offs. So
Right.
under level D, the recommendation of 20 to 26 months is talking about confinement, but the court has the opportunity at that level in lieu of county confinement, let's say. You could sentence the person to probation that includes restrictive conditions. And then the way we talk about that currently, and I think we would replicate that here, would be you would have a day-for-day trade-off to be within the standard range of guidelines. So you would have, say, some period like 5 years of probation, for example, and then 20 months of that is a restrictive condition. And it could be any number of restrictive conditions that you choose.
Yeah, the only qualifier on that is, I think we retain the same rule we have right now about drug dependent offenders.
okay, so I thought, and then the other question is, I would still need to make them reentry eligible.
If you wanted to release them earlier than the minute and you weren't using probation. So let's just think about the current practices and we apply it to this. So you have a minimum sentence range of 18 to 22 months or whatever it was, to 8, whatever it was. So under the current practice, we say, here's the sentence recommendation. First, if the court wants to use restrictive conditions in lieu of confinement, the first question is the person drug dependent? If so, you do an assessment to determine the clinical recommendation, and then the trade-off is either that clinical recommendation to treatment or the confinement sentence. And then if during that first inquiry, you find out the person is not drug dependent, then as Ryan said, it's a day-to-day trade-off. And then there's a lot of different ways you could do that, right? You could say, I'm going to do a split sentence and I'm going to give a 6 to 12-month sentence that takes care of 6 months of confinement. And I'm going to do a consecutive, probation for whatever and have restrictive conditions. Or you can do, here's probation and it's an entire 12 months of restrictive conditions. So, there's a lot of different ways you can accommodate the restrictive time, the confinement time. Other questions?
So just so I'm clear on this.
Sure.
So what, Ryan, so what you're saying, so use the judge's example, 20 to 26. So you're saying you could sentence 20 to 40 and then probation with restrictive conditions in addition to that, or 20 months, say at the bottom end, would be the restricted portion of the probation,
Right.
correct? So they could be incarcerated in the state correctional institution?
No, so just think about, you're choosing, we'll give you 2 alternatives to choose from.
Yeah.
If we start with confinement, the recommendation is 20 to 26 months at the minimum. And you say, this person's a good candidate for probation with restrictive conditions. And so you're going to use that in lieu of county confinement. So let's just take confinement off the table, keep it simple. Sentence the person to a period of probation, 5 years. We'll keep it at 5 years. And then because the commission's recommendation is for a confinement sentence, and you're using probation with restrictive conditions in lieu of it, what Mark talked about is we have some rules of the road. Drug and alcohol dependent, as Mark mentioned, or if not, then we have this day-for-day trade-off where you can do probation with restrictive conditions here. You just have to at least do a period of those restrictive conditions would be 20 months up to 26 months to sort of comply with the guidelines.
And not necessarily confined.
Right.
Could be
So you could fashion and say 5 years of probation with restricted conditions, and then the first 20 months will be served on in-home electronic monitoring, or the first 12 months will be in-home electronic monitoring, followed by some other part of it.
But could any part of that be incarceration?
It could.
But if it's 20 months, then it's a state sentence.
Well, and here's one of the things, I think we got off on the wrong track by starting with level D as the focus, because remember, no offense, Judge,
I'd like to
but-
say it was A and.
No, okay, but so remember, our current policy focuses on level 3 and 4 as allowing this trade-off, right? But under our current policy, 3 and 4 are sort of the, it's county jail sentences or the lower tier of state prison sentences. It's not typical state prison sentences. It's the understanding that, there's some of these cases that could be housed locally. So we're not talking these huge minimum terms that we want to trade off with restrictive conditions. We're trying to think of, sentences that are comparable to county jail sentences that you're using restrictive conditions either in lieu of part or all of it. And that's how our current policy works, and that's how it works with the treatment alternative. So when we get up to level D and we start to get into these, big minimum term things, it seems odd that we're talking, 20 months of restrictive conditions, because the general, our general take over the years was there's a limit to how long you have someone on something like house arrest or electronic monitoring. And it's probably, 12 months or something like that. It's not 20 months on electronic monitoring. So that's where you just have, I think we have to be careful about using level D as our example.
But I think the problem is we've narrowed, we're in these narrower guideline ranges now. Now I look at this and I'm gonna have, a defense attorney arguing for probation, basically,
My guy
albeit
can pay
with
for the electronic.
EM and
monitoring.
house arrest, when the guidelines are saying state sentence to you, 20
Right.
to 26, that's a huge range.
Right.
And
And I'm glad actually you both raised this, Judge. I won't give you total credit for looking at D, but so the question is, should we be removing RC from all of level D, from part of level D? Is because I see what you're saying is concern. Our focus was to make sure it was on county confinement, and we have that there. If on state confinement, it's an all or none proposition, then, we can remove it from all of that. If you think there's like marginal areas, we can do it. The reason we put it in there was that if you look at the current guidelines, level 4 of the current guidelines is sort of like that D. And we allow it in level 4, even though it's not used a lot, but we allow the trade-off at level 4. So we're trying to develop this sort of consistent with our current guidelines. But we never put RC in the current guidelines. We just said level 4 allows for a trade-off. Because remember, it's not always about a day-to-day trade-off for restrictive conditions. It's the idea of using drug treatment in lieu of incarceration for those individuals.
So I think I already know which attorneys are gonna come in, and they're gonna have people with much more serious offenses who are paying to be on electronic monitor while somebody below them is sitting in jail. I just think,
So how
and I
about if
think when
we,
you spell it out, that is bad.
how about if we remove RC from level D, but courts could always do that as an aggravated or a mitigated sentence in terms of that trade-off.
I mean, how many people
There's no
do that
prohibition.
trade-off? I don't, Judge First and I were talking last night, we're here and we're plugged into some of this, but how much does that actually happen? I'm sure
I think
all
it's
my
whatever
colleagues
is
don't even know about
negotiated.
it.
I think it's whatever is negotiated. And I think at the lower tier of level D, the 12 to 18, 16 to 22, there's some cases, but I think it's more about drug treatment. I don't
Right.
think I think it's that someone's drug dependent, we're gonna put them in treatment in lieu of incarceration, because the alternatives would be to send them to state prison and get them into state drug treatment program.
Yeah, but I mean, if you take the drug treatment aspect out of it, are people doing this trade-off?
But DUIs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
But so anyway, the reason I mentioned the trade-off is it's in the guidelines, and that's sort of what we're talking about, but appreciate that that's a big number. And I'm not so sure that we see the trade-off as much, but when Mark's talking about, we see a lot of drug and alcohol
Sure.
violations, and then of course DUIs, that is the big driver of anything. We have DUIs that are level 3, level 4 in the current value.
So then stick an asterisk, and the asterisk to say it's to seated code section number for anybody who bothers to go there. Because
Well, how
because
about
I
we
think
just,
this just opens a massive.
yeah, how about we
Because
just
a lot of
remove it?
people are just live by this, yeah, and I'm gonna say even,
Well, we love that.
I'd be willing to bet if you,
You're living by
but
it.
just,
That's cool.
I'm just gonna see you not agree, like beyond this, how they're not flipping through 42.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So as, oh, come.
and I just, if you polled judges, and maybe I'm wrong, and you ask them what RC stands for.
Yeah.
What percentage of judges do you think are gonna know, or like, do you think will say like, oh, RC restricted conditions?
Yeah, I mean, I know because I run our recovery course and we use it a lot, you know, for our intermediate punishments program.
Yeah, hopefully the four of us, the five of ours on there too, we all know what RC stands for, but
Yeah.
I agree.
broadly.
Yeah.
I'm saying if you pull it to help explain CIP and what happened
Right.
to it and what it now is, it's complex.
Mhm.
Okay,
It changes, so,
we
I
will
just think we need to
remove
clarify
RC
what
from
RC
level D.
and then we need to clarify what RC is or how they use it in some form.
Right. Well, but first step, we'll just remove it
Yes.
from level D. We'll retain in level C. Clearly, we'll be, you know, this is a new concept and we're trying to blend it in, so we get that. I think Ryan's point, though, is a good one regarding DUI offenses,
Mhm.
because under the proposal we have and with the new legislation, you're gonna have those 1-year DUIs that are fourth or fifth subsequent kind of offenses. We start at an OGS, the sort of the baseline for the highest tier, I think, is an OGS 13. These are the new felony 3 or felony 2 offenses. So you're going to get that lower tier of D to start with. And then what we're saying is, as an enhancement, it could move up 2 steps. If you have a 6th offense or whatever, it could be an OGS 15 for a DUI, which is a felony 2 offense. So again, we can remove the RS, and that's not a problem, or RC, that's not a problem, but it's just recognizing that that's where DUIs are, as felony 2s. for
But if
those
you're a
repeat
5th or 6th
circumstances.
DUI, why?
Well, no, I totally get that. I'm just saying, I'm just pointing that out, that that's where it would fall in the new list. So we'll remove RC from D. That's the takeaway.
Right, we can still do it.
You can still do it,
Yeah.
and we can, in the commentary and everything else, we can go into much more detail of that.
But you said it exists now.
It does,
So
it
people
does.
want to, yeah,
But I think, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, historically, when county IP came in the 90s or whatever, it was mostly, the trade-off was at a county sentence level.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right, but keep in mind, at that time, the 2 to 5 maxes could be served in the county jail too, and so that's why we added in level
I got you.
4, because we said, well, there might be those, you know, for whatever reason. But I think that I'm really glad this issue came up, because I think this is an improvement to remove it, recognizing courts can do it if they want to, but it truly, it would not be typical, it would be an exception. And the exception may be more often for treatment in lieu of incarceration rather than this day-to-day trade-off for like house arrest.
Outside of DUIs and drug treatment, do you see many sentences of probation with restricted conditions?
Well, we saw about 10, well, that's a good question. A lot of them were for DUI, but I think in our data, I think it was 10 or 15% of cases were getting CIP in the old days. But I assume like 75% of those were DUI. So it's not a lot, but you know, simple assault.
and doesn't it impact funding, because like a lot of things that could just be probation, but your person needs some kind of treatment or something, I'll impose probation restricted conditions.
Right.
And then impose that, but I believe it impacts
Yeah.
our ability to receive funding, which helps us to keep those programs.
I mean, playing by the rules is, yeah, that's the one thing. Okay. Any other suggestions or questions about the matrix?
A 10-second comment, just that the reason I I know we already decided, so I'm glad for that, but like you said, they can still do it, but I always think when you say these guidelines are typical offenses, typical offenders, then when they are those unique circumstances, they still have that authority, but it's not a fallback, and it's not an ability for things to be.
No, great point, great point. All right, thank you. So, so we'll incorporate those changes that were discussed. So here's a number of other issues that I just wanted to put on the table, and then we're going to switch to other guidelines. For lapsing provisions, during the July 28th meeting, there was some questions or interest in trying to figure out what other jurisdictions did. So Jordan in Brett's unit prepared a summary of juvenile adjudication and adult conviction lapsing policies in other Pennsylvania jurisdictions. And so we have prepared that document, we posted it, but I know it wasn't emailed to you a couple of days ago. So we will make sure we email it to you. But it's just, I think it's helpful to look at, but I think as you'd sort of expect, every state's different, and you know, it's hard to like cut and paste what other states are doing into ours, but it does get to this sort of general policy discussion about how to lapse and how does that lapsing apply. And let me just sort of remind you of some of the general concepts that we've been talking about, and we'll just assume that unless you have objections, we'll build these into whatever draft we're doing for the December meeting. So on the juvenile side, a couple of things that we've discussed and were part of the July 28th discussions. Number one, the Juvenile Court Judges Commission suggested that for consideration of juvenile adjudications in the prior record score, we should increase the age from 14 to 16. Understanding that if anything is certified or direct file, they're going to be criminal counts. We have those as convictions, but for juvenile adjudications, moving the threshold from 14 to 16 was one of their suggestions, consistent with brain science and all that other kind of stuff. The second suggestion was, and something that we put in the proposals and talked about in July, was to have some sort of age-based lapsing provisions for juvenile adjudications. So the thresholds are basically 21 years of age, 25 years of age, 28 years of age. And the idea for 21 and 25, where we look at basically prior lesser offenses like M1s, F3s, would just lapse at 21 years of age. We wouldn't look at law-abiding behavior, it'd be treated like DUI, like a look-back period. But at age 21, prior lower level juvenile adjudications would be lapsed. At age 25, everything but crimes of violence would be lapsed. And then at 28, we would start consideration of crimes of violence, but that would require 10 years of law-abiding behavior. So for crimes of violence, you'd have to have 10 years of law-abiding behavior from the last adjudication or conviction. So it would be a 10-year gap period. That would be gap. But the other provisions would be decay periods for juvenile adjudication. So that's consistent with what Judge Tucker's raised as far as concerns about even considering juvenile adjudications. The Juvenile Court Judges Commission raised that same concern, but like an accommodation here was, let's increase the age at which we even consider juvenile adjudications, and then let's have some sort of hard breaks. And the exception would be violent offenses. Some of those, a number of those might have been transferred over anyhow, but if they remained in the juvenile system, we treat them differently, and we make it a law-abiding period for 10 years. So unless there's objections or other suggestions, we'll just keep that in what we have in, which we provided in July, and we'll provide that for you in December for your review.
Yeah, sure. So, just keep going down the road, hypotheticals,
Yeah.
they're never ending, but, So you have a juvenile with a VUFA charge. Right. At 24, he commits a robbery. At 25, the VUFA charge is going away.
It is. But we have the same language as we talked about earlier.
For
that
prior
the
record
court-
score.
For prior record score.
But would it impact the prior record score anymore anyways, if they get that offense when they're 20, whatever age you put them at, 24? So if at 24, they commit. That's
So,
a big
It
offense.
would be there at
For the
that point,
24.
but if a year later, it would not. You're right. If they were 26 and committed a robbery, the VUFA from there as a juvenile adjudication would not count under the policy we're talking.
And in the realm of the absurd, like a VUFA every year from the age of 16 to 25, they all go away at 25.
They do, but two things. Number one, the language that we have right now, we can build into this is that the court can always consider those things. I mean, what we're trying to do is set up rules or guidelines about typical cases. And so the question is that typical for juveniles? What we heard in the research was, I think, 6% of our cases even have juvenile adjudications at all, right? But if the person is committing a VUFA every year up until 25, all the adult ones count. It's just the juvenile ones would go away. So from 16, 17 would go away, 18 it would count. So, I mean, I get your point, and we're thinking that, in the juvenile court, for serious juvenile matters, there's, direct file and transfers, there's certification. If there's, for these kind of offenses, by 25, which is where the VUFAs would be, they'd be that just less of crimes of violence. 25 would be the point of time. So you'd be able to see the criminal history from 18 to 25. That's 7 years of, if they're continuing to offend, they're building up a criminal record. If they haven't offended at all during that period of time, that's what we're saying, then, those juvenile adjudications would go away and it wouldn't count as a prior record score.
And there's some M1 VUFAs, so they go away at 21.
They would.
So you're 17, you get a VUFA charge. Now you're 21 and you commit an armed robbery. The prior VUFA is not part of your prior record score for sentencing guidelines.
And that's where that language in the guidelines, and we can look at that language, but it does say if the prior record score like underestimates the series of criminal behavior or something, or overestimates it, the court can do it, which is just saying these are typical, and is that typical? Is there something about the offender that should or should not be
But
considered?
if we have specific language that says they lapse, then do we really think that a court can say we can still use it even though there's specific language that says it lapses?
Well, I think that's where, I mean, we have that right now, where we say what's critical is that you appropriately calculate the guidelines. So for instance, if there's a lapsing, you cannot include that in the calculation of the prior record score. It doesn't mean the court can't consider it, and that's the language we have now, that we say, that we recognize that sometimes these like macro guidelines underestimate or overestimate seriousness. And so we say it's important that you calculate them by the rules. And so that's where the lapsing thing would come in. So you couldn't like add it in even though we say it lapses. But once you've done that, if the court looks at this and said, there might not be charges here, but there's something about that or that, because this is a robbery and that was a firearms offense, that the court can do that. And we can look at that language and clarify it or expand on it, whatever else, but.
I forget, there's a, that's my bill once upon a time. There's a juvenile felonies make you a prohibited person until a certain age. But I forget what that age is.
There's a loophole.
I want to say it's like 25. I just wonder if that,
Juvenile adjudication.
there's
Person
61.5.
possessed, yeah.
But I thought that you were prohibited for a certain number of years. I thought it was until 25.
Is this under, is VUCA?
Yeah, I think it's 6105.
I mean, if there's something like that, if there's something we can point to and we can do it as an exception, that's fine. That makes sense.
I mean, I'll play it.
Yeah, but-
At the same time, doesn't.
Okay. Yeah, well, the rep's looking at that. I think we have some people in line. I think we're Attorney Marsico, so maybe we can open up comment there.
Mark.
Good morning. Yes.
Yeah, hi, guys. So can you explain the decay provision that District of Columbia uses? I'm just trying to make sure I'm reading this right. 10 years from expiration of sentence, prior felony convictions can be revived. I don't know what that means. And prior misdemeanors can never be revived. I mean, do you guys know a little bit more about that? Because I mean, the one thing I think I would like to see, I know we're doing this gap, we're looking at these gap policies, but I think we should consider something along of decay for very old cases, but especially where I see cases where very old felony affect the guidelines disproportionately in a existing misdemeanor case.
Sure. So we'll have to look at the DC policy just to be sure, but you know, as you mentioned, the big difference between decay and gap is that decay is just a timing of the matter, like we have with DUI. So you know, 10-year period passes and it's no longer considered. Whereas as gap, it's some definition of law-abiding behavior. I think for purpose of the DC policy, when they're like recalibrating or revitalizing something, we'll check into that. But I think it sounds more like a gap policy than a decay policy. But we'll check with them. It could be that you know only certain things trigger the reconsideration or the extension of that period of time. But we will check on that and you know make sure we get back to you on that. But I think you raise a really good point, and this is one of the separations that we're trying to put in place between juvenile adjudications and adult convictions, and that is that there would be a sort of a presumption on the juvenile side for juvenile adjudications that it's a decay, because it addresses some of those other concerns that were raised about even using a juvenile adjudication. So we're using age, brain development, whatever else as reasons that might be the preferred policy. And I think, you know, if there's exceptions, we should identify those. But I think, you know, the easier approach to making it, you know, age-based or something like that, I think it is better. I think when we get to the adult conviction side, at least based on feedback we had, there were a lot of comments that we should be more inclined to go with a gap policy, that they're law-abiding behavior. And I think to the degree that we have a separate policy there, it might be for misdemeanors versus felonies. That misdemeanors, we might think more of a decay policy, and felonies think of a gap policy. The thing about gap policy is it's just really difficult to implement. And so we're going to have to just put the burden on someone. And if the burden's on the prosecution for determining the prior record score, it seems to me that if we're talking about removing something from the prior record score, so a lapsing of something, I think we're going to have to put the burden of providing the information to the court on the defense. And I mean, that's what we had in one of the earlier drafts. And I think we just have to think of a way we have to set up rules and then figure out who's going to be holding the bag on trying to prove it. But that's sort of that's what we've been thinking about in terms of formulating policy. Yeah.
Yeah, so under 6105,
It's C7.
Yeah, C8. Says person who's adjudicated delinquent by a court, blah, 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 blah. As a result of conduct which if committed by an adult would constitute an offense enumerated in subsection B. With the exception of those crimes set forth in paragraph 7, this prohibition shall terminate 15 years after the last applicable delinquent adjudication or upon the person reaching the age of 30, whichever is earlier.
Okay.
And I'm trying to think how, there are obviously different, this is establishing a crime versus whether something's included in your guidelines. And I'm just trying to think of how this whole provision would interplay. So you theoretically have somebody who is committing a felony by illegally possessing a firearm, but the offense which renders them ineligible to possess the firearm is no longer included in the prior record score because it was eliminated when they turned to 25.
But it wouldn't be eliminated for that calculation.
No, it would still be a crime, but it just,
Right.
it seems inconsistent to me that we're gonna say, this is gonna count to make you a prohibited person until you're 30.
Yeah.
But it's not gonna count towards your prior record score after you're 25.
Well,
I just want, and I'm not necessarily saying that's a problem, I'm just sort of
right.
throwing that issue out there to think about.
But I mean, one thing we could do is, if we're going to do a carve out, let's think categorical. So do you include VUFA or do you include 6105 as along with crimes of violence in that top category where you move to a gap and you move to 25 years or 10 years of crime free or whatever, that you just say, it's crimes of violence and this provision or VUFA or whatever other things. I think you can, let's look at sort of the three categories we came up with, like decay at 21, decay at 25, VUFA at 28, or COV at 28. Would we just put it in the fourth category?
Or move that 28 to 30 so that at least, you still the issue about the ones at 25. There's really two issues because you're gonna have the same thing occurring at 28. It strikes me as somewhat inconsistent to say that these aren't gonna, and I agree with, we need to have lapsing,
Right.
some type of lapsing policy. I'm not saying these convictions should last forever.
Right.
But I do feel like there should be some consistency.
Okay, and that's, so we can put some of that, we can look at some of that and try to, draft some things, because the reason we used 28 was 10 years from 18 years of age. And we were saying if someone was law abiding for 10 years from the last juvenile adjudication, that makes sense. That's sort of consistent. But I get for this, if there's something in statute about 30, maybe we move that whole thing to 30, or, we can try to look at some of these things, but, one of the fallbacks is, how typical is this? How often does this happen? And is this something that we ask judges to exercise discretion on, or that we build into the structure of the guidelines?
Can we find out how many 16 and 17-year-olds have juvenile VUFA for a period of time?
I think we can find that because we did research before just to find out how many juvenile adjudications there are, period. Like I said, I think it was 6%.
Yeah.
And then there was a pretty low recidivism rate. It gets to be pretty small numbers, but I get it, as policy, we should figure out what that is. So we can get back to everyone regarding specifics on VUFA.
Now, there must be some issue with this statute because the DAs presented to me legislation to fix something about it that I think was a result of a court decision or something. So I don't remember what it was because it was several sessions ago, and I know that the bill didn't pass.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I don't think it was considered. So I don't know the current state of that statute either. Not doing fair. There's certainly something about it that the DAs.
Well,
want to
look,
fix.
we'll talk offline. We'll see what we can come up with. And then, as I said, this is all directed towards providing all members with draft guidelines to review during the December meeting. And the idea then is, we always have a, Wednesday, Thursday kind of meeting. I think what we'll try to do is schedule a Wednesday 1 to 5 meeting as we did this time. But it'll all be about just looking through the draft that we've prepared for the 8th edition sentencing guidelines. And you'll see that there's other guidelines we'll give you drafts on as well. And trying to see if there's any kind of clarifications with the idea that during the Thursday business meeting, we would be looking for the commission to approve the draft so that we can hold public hearings in February, March, and then the commission would be positioned to adopt, if they wanted to at that point, those guidelines to submit to the General Assembly, which would put us on track for the January 1st, 2024 effective date of the 8th edition guidelines. So, we'll talk about some of these issues. Let me tell you 2 or 3 other issues with the sentencing guidelines that we've talked about and that we'll work on drafting and putting into the draft. The first was we provided previously some language during the July 28th meeting on concurrent consecutive policy. I think, we said basically during a criminal proceeding or a sentencing proceeding, judicial proceeding, the assumption would be that sentences for lesser offenses would be sentenced concurrently, and the exceptions to that would be if there's multiple victims. If there's, I think there were a couple of other exceptions, multiple victims. Anyone recall? Okay, thank you. And we did receive an email from someone that had some suggestions about circumstances that we might want to have as I think it's multiple instances. I'll find it. Here we have exceptions include convictions for crimes of violence, proceedings involving multiple victims, and offenses for which consecutive sentences are required by law. So those were the 3 exceptions to the general policy. But again, courts can do whatever they want. It's just setting a general policy about concurrent consecutive. And then we did receive comments where the issue that was raised was, what if you have an incident where you have 2 sort of different kind of harms? Like someone's charged with assault, but then there's like distributing photos of minors or something like that. 2 like very different things that are in an incident. So, is that typical? Was that, whatever? Is that where the court would just say, well, here's an exception? Or so we'll have to see if there's some other language or exception that we should build in. But then we want to think about the other side of the equation. And it's not just when the General Assembly requires consecutive sentences, but are there explicit circumstances where the commission in the guidelines recommends concurrent consecutive sentences? And so I mentioned yesterday several provisions around trafficking and so forth, human trafficking that may be worth considering. So section 3011 and 3012, as well as section 3133, were areas where the commission may want to consider recommendations about consecutive sentencing. And on my list. So section 3011 is trafficking in individuals. Section 3012 is involuntary servitude. And in both of those sections, there are sometimes convictions as well for rape, IDSI, or kidnapping. And in the statute, that's when there is a statutory max of life that's available. And in those circumstances, the commission is also supposed to provide an enhancement. So we have an enhancement in terms of trafficking or involuntary servitude about increasing the OGS. And then the question is, if you're convicted of both that offense and an associated offense of rape, should the commission be recommending consecutive sentencing? So the two separate harms are considered. We don't have to, but it's one of those things where, we're supposed to have some kind of enhancement, and we can do that either by just increasing the severity of that offense because there's an associated offense. We can do it just by a consecutive sentence, or we can do a combination. So that's just one issue that we put out there for consideration. We don't have to decide today, but I wanted to mention that. So the same applies to involuntary servitude as with trafficking. And then 3133 deals with sexual extortion. And so sort of the same kind of thing. There's usually associated other offenses. And the question is consecutive sentencing something that the commission wants to include in a recommendation? And the only reason I point this out in this context is if we're coming up with a general policy saying general things are concurrent except with these circumstances, is there something we want to put in the guidelines where we sort of exclude that, or we actively say no, consecutive is how we should recommend this, even though the court can do whatever the court wishes. So I just point those out. The other two areas about consecutive sentencing that we should keep in mind is one, the new DUI statute for third and subsequent DUIs. There's now an automatic requirement of consecutive sentencing. And for 3735 homicide by vehicle while DUIs, there's the if there's multiple victims, there's a requirement for consecutive sentencing. So those would be listed as exceptions to the rule. Right.
Mr. McKinson from Senator Street.
Oh,
There's
yes.
Hand raised, and I just want to make sure.
Sure, please.
Hey guys, hey, thanks. Fortunately, my video is not functioning. I apologize for that. But I just wanted to ask, in terms of lapsing of juvenile records over a 10-year period of good behavior, or no, I guess no bad behavior, what are we talking? Is there any criteria? Like, are we talking if they shoplift, that counts as not, if they over a period of 10 years they had maybe like a jaywalking or a shoplifting thing or something, would that disqualify them from that?
Right, that's a great question. Under the current lapsing policy that we do have for juvenile adjudications, we exclude summary offenses, and we exclude, I think, the first M3. I think that's how we do it. So we do have that as a carve out. So in your instance, if there was a single M3, that would not undo the lapsing provision. But otherwise, any kind of misdemeanor or felony would trigger or would cease the lapsing. And so that would be a question as well for the commission about how do you define, a new conviction offense? Is it any misdemeanor or felony? I'm sure we exclude summary offenses, but is there, how do we look at that? So thanks. That will be something that we'll return to in December when we look at the draft.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So let me close with two final things that were raised during July. And again, if there's any comments as staff works on the draft. The one was the aggravating and mitigating factors that are listed. So we provided in the document a list based on what we heard during public hearings and what we had provided in advance as far as some of the adjustments that we removed, but we embedded those into a list of aggravating and mitigating factors. And I think during the meeting, some members had raised some questions about, should some of these be included, and others suggested maybe there were others. Now, I don't think I received any comments, so we'll keep looking at this list. We'll look back through the public testimony that we received and any kind of comments that you have. We'll also look at the reasons reported to the commission for aggravated and mitigated sentences. and see if there's anything that changes in this list. But this is the list we have right now. And unless we get other information, we'll be moving through with this list and put it in the draft that we provide to you. And then the final thing was, I mentioned yesterday that we talk a lot about problem-solving courts, but we really don't have anything built into the guidelines regarding the use of problem-solving courts like we do for clinical assessments and treatment as a trade-off at level 3. So if there's any suggestions about ways of incorporating problem-solving courts or risk needs responsivity assessments, things like that into the guidelines, let us know. We'll take a shot at, at especially at level C, I guess, which are county jail sentences, to see if there's some language we can put in there to broaden the consideration of problem-solving courts.
And D with the DUI laws.
And DUI, yeah. So we'll take a look at that. But as I said, we're on track to get that draft to you before the December meeting. Then we'll spend that Wednesday of the December meeting just reviewing it in anticipation of it being approved on Thursday, so that we can have public hearings early next year. The other two areas, so we're done with sentencing guidelines now. Thank you for your patience. Got through that slog. What's that? Uh-oh. Go ahead, Judge.
Just a suggestion
Sure,
for the
sure.
thought.
Please.
When you were talking about concurrent, consecutive,
Yeah.
and do we carve out sections where we recommend? So as of now, we're saying recommending concurrent, unless there's multiple victims, crime or violence, and where it's consecutive like by law. Instead, do we want to think about the concept of when we're making that list of times where there's exceptions or any other like overriding facts where the public safety necessitates a consecutive sentence, something like that,
Okay.
which is sort of the catch-all where if we can articulate what that is, we put it consecutive and then we don't have to add on consecutive, but it spells out there are other times, because those facts where you have a kidnapping and then someone goes to the gas station and commits a robbery with the victim in the car, like, so those are things where you would think, well, that sort of necessitates a consecutive sentence. So
Sure.
anyway,
Yeah.
so that was a thought.
No,
And
thank
then
you.
super
That's
fast
great.
is you'll be, I'm assuming, sending out what we're reviewing. We will be reviewing for the Wednesday meeting prior to the
In
Wednesday
advance,
meeting.
that's correct.
So do we want to at least encourage submissions of written suggestions and proposals prior to meeting together on
Yeah, that would
Wednesday?
be great.
So, okay,
That would be great.
that's
Absolutely.
my recommendation.
So we'll try to, there's always more work than there's time, but we'll try to get the draft out to you a couple weeks in advance, maybe, the beginning of maybe, maybe in November, like before Thanksgiving. So
None of us are
sometime.
looking until 2 days before. so
I
you
know,
can-
but, yeah, but the thing is, it gets us off our plate, and then if you do actually look at it, and you have some specific issues, you can get them to us, and we can work on drafts of changes.
Yes, I may have one question.
Yes, I'm sorry, Judge Sally.
No, sorry. Right, he's Sunday.
Okay, quick question. So, Mark, under aggravated and mitigated circumstances,
Mhm.
one of the questions I have is, I think, this has been covered multiple times, but I'm still having some issues with it. And that is, what's the point of the encouraging courts to use the different reasons that are stated there for mitigated or aggravated circumstances?
Yeah, well, I think the key reason is when we're going through processes like this of assigning offense gravity scores, what we find is there are oftentimes, the majority of sentences are in the mitigated range or below the guidelines, but there's no reasons provided, or it's because it's a negotiated plea. So if the commission was thinking about, well, should we change the assignment, it would be helpful to know, well, why are we changing it? Why is the sentence like too high? And sometimes it's just because, that's what's been negotiated. but sometimes it's because there's a certain factor that is a common factor that we just don't have built into the guidelines. So over the years, one of the ways that we have addressed those issues is when there's a common factor raised, we then subcategorize the offense. So you can think about like corruption of minors. You know, for the longest time, it was a single offense in the crimes code. But when we looked at the data, we saw a lot of cases where there were aggravated sentences. And there wasn't any explanation for it until we like really tried to focus on it. And we found that it was a difference between the nature of the corruption. Like sometimes it was alcohol versus not, and sometimes it was sexual issues, you know, sexual whatever behaviors. And so the commission then used that to subcategorize and increase recommendations linked to that. So the idea of getting better feedback, first, it's required for departures from the guidelines, and we don't get very good reasons there. And then even for mitigated and aggravated, it helps the commission to consider changes to the guidelines so that there's greater uniformity in sentencing, which is what the commission is supposed to be doing for providing more targeted recommendations.
Well, I appreciate that, Mark. Is it still the commission's intent to include recommended sort of those specific examples of potential factors for mitigation or for mitigation or aggravation?
Yeah, I think where this all started was we were going to have adjustments for those more subjective reasons built into the guideline, like pre-sentencing. And I think the pushback both in public hearings and as we discussed as a commission was that's just not practical. So one of the resolutions was we should try to capture what those common reasons are and put them before the court at sentencing so that we can get a better articulation of why judges are doing what they are doing, but also sort of identifying these more subjective reasons at sentencing or these factors that are in place. I think what we're trying to do with the listing is not focus so much on aggravated versus mitigated, because some of these factors fall into both categories. You know, they're used one way or the other. But more in terms of what are the factors that adjust maybe the offense issues, you know, offense-related factors versus maybe offender-related factors, individual characteristics, character, stuff like that. So what we tried to do was come up with a little bit different formulation that it's not necessarily, you know, that we point to it as an aggravating factor. We just say, here's a factor related to the offense. And did that influence the sentence?
Well, I appreciate that explanation. I mean, I can tell you that just by nature of being a DA, I mean, I just have a problem with seeing victim-induced or facilitated an incident. I mean, it just bothers me. I mean, I hate to be sort of, you know, vague on why, but I mean, the reality is that, you know, I see people grabbing onto that, and I see that turning into its own fight and litigation and argument when it comes down to sentencing hearings. And I would defer to the judges on the commission. I'm curious what their thoughts are on the impact of having specific I don't even know what you want to call it, examples of factors that can be taken into consideration on whether or not you aggravate or mitigate a sentence. I would be curious to know what our commission colleagues that are judges think about that.
I would say that the cheat sheet I use is just factors that have been developed through case law.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whether it be mitigating or aggravating. And I cite to that when I depart.
Yeah.
This is just, look, I would agree. In essence, I mean, you have to give a reason for the sentencing. You have to. I mean, that's case law. So it's relatively easy to look down a list of things as opposed to scratching your head and grapple with what you're trying to do when it's already there. It's really not a suggestion. It's just a a fact that you're just revealing.
Yeah, and we're just finding a way to try to get that into our data because it often is missing. So, so look, we're happy to remove things from the list. We're happy to add things from the list to the list. And so I appreciate you raising this specific one, and we can remove that. And I just encourage everyone to sort of look at that so that during the December meeting, we can, if we're going to keep a list, we have one that you're comfortable with taking to public hearings. And if we don't want to have a list at all, we should talk about whether we incorporate some of these things into SGS Web so that at least for purposes of reporting sentences, we have some better information or categories. Because sometimes we know judges at times will, photocopy our reasons reported for aggravated and mitigated and have them on the bench. And, they'll report 3A. And it's like, well, what's 3A? Well, it's, look at your list,
So I completely understand and I appreciate it. And it makes perfect sense to me. I know there's, I guess maybe I'm just stuck on, a victim facilitates an incident by just being there.
Yeah.
You
No,
facilitate an incident down the street
Yeah, and we don't want to be in the business of victim blaming, and I appreciate that. That was one of the reasons that was recommended during public hearings, and that's why we included it. But that's why you guys are commissioners in terms of helping us to sort of vet through a list and either add or subtract those that are listed. So I appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate the explanation. I appreciate the input from the judges that chimed in as well. So thank you.
Great.
And in addition, there's always room for the DA and defense to present argument or comment. So it's there. It's not like you're being blocked from saying or doing anything. It's there. But I can tell you, I mean, it really is helpful to have that. And it has been for me anyway. And I am one of those judges who, when I was sitting in criminal, who had that on the bench. As a matter of fact, I have a sentencing sheet with all the charges and everything. And on the back of it, I do have a section of mitigating and aggravating. And I look at it and that's part of the record. I just reveal why I'm doing what I'm doing. It just makes it so much easier. And at the same time, it gives the litigants counsel to state a reason why they agree or they disagree. And
in light of what the 8th edition sentencing guidelines will look like, it seems clear that some of the ranges will be tightened significantly from where they were before. That I think will result in prosecutors and defense attorneys putting a lot more emphasis into their arguments on whether or not something should be aggravated or mitigated. And that's that was my thought pattern as I was thinking through this. That's all.
And I agree, and that just makes it more relevant in terms of what the judge will have to really do in terms of thinking it out, because again, it is of record. It will be part of the appeal, should it be appealed, and would have to be justified on the record.
Great. Thank you. Judge Daly?
I just had a question, and I may have been out of the room, but has the commission ever weighed in on consecutive concurrence?
It is not. We've discussed it a long time, and there has always been a concern that we're so focused on the individual offense and coming up with a recommendation for that offense, and then we're silent on what happens if there's more than one offense. So there's always been, I think, the discussion about doing it. The difficulty has been coming up with a definition that works. And so we want it to be fairly broad, and we want it to be a general recommendation, not particularly specific, but to provide some guidance. And the model penal code, the new one on sentencing, really does promote having a policy about concurrent consecutive. And so this is our first attempt.
And my other question, I guess, or observation, by way of a visual, have you considered like taking charges under the current guidelines and sentencing into current charges under the proposed guidelines, the sentencing, so you can actually see
Yeah,
what the difference is.
one of the things that, and I think we should be doing that for the public hearings.
Yeah.
But one of the things is it's been sort of a moving target. So we need to sort of know what the guidelines are. And believe me, Christie has been after me to like have us know what the guidelines are, because when they're trying to do programming for a new application, they need to know what they are. So, but I think that's a great idea. And I think once we know what the final decision is, then we can map these things out. And in fact, that was one of the things I think that Brett talked about yesterday in terms of doing like a mapping of the current and proposed guidelines. So, great point. So I know we have to come to a close. Let me just mention one other issue regarding guidelines, not sentencing guidelines, but parole guidelines. Back during the June meeting, the commission adopted the parole guidelines. And as I mentioned yesterday, we've been working with the parole board sort of on two tracks. One is to review those guidelines that were adopted to make sure that they're aware of how they would operate. And we were sort of vetting what was adopted by the commission. And then secondly, working with them to automate this so that we had a data collection system. And the board has been great in working with the DOC as well, in really developing a mechanism where they can incorporate the parole guidelines into their data system, and then also have a reporting of decisions to us. So we're really happy with the progress we're making with the board. One of the things we found, though, where there was a couple of areas where there were just questions. I don't think there was anything wrong or incorrect in what we did, but there was an interest in maybe having a bit of clarification about what was adopted. And so I've held off on submitting anything to the General Assembly and to the General Assembly for review, because we thought we would include a couple of definitions that would help clarify things and make a modest change to the document, the guideline form that we had as an example. And I just wanted to review this with the commission to make sure there weren't any questions before it was submitted to the General Assembly. So here are a handful of things. We use misconducts as one of the factors in the parole guidelines, and we actually use it in two different ways. We have general misconduct, and then we have when misconduct is assaultive behavior. And we use those in the guidelines, but we don't have them in our definition section. So, it's all explained there, but we define a lot of other terms in the guidelines, but we don't define misconduct being, how the DOC captures it, what data we're using. So we thought we'd add a definition of misconduct to the definition section. So it doesn't change the guidelines, it just explains misconduct. The second thing is there is a violence indicator on the guideline form, and we talk about violent offender. And in talking to the parole board, they use an instrument called the Offender Violence Risk Typology, or OVERT, OVRT, to determine if someone's violent or not. And we use that to develop the guidelines. It's in the guideline form, but we don't mention the OVERT. So we thought it would be helpful, again, in the definition section, to just be clear about where the source is, because then if someone's just looking at the guidelines, they can figure out what we're relying on instead of just that it's a violent case. And related to that, the OVERT, one of the factors the OVERT takes into account is a 10-year look back period. And although that's built into the whole thing, we don't have that in the definition of violent offender, that a prior violent offense is 10 years back. So that's been part of all the analysis, but it's not in the definition. So again, in talking to Professor Missick, these are very technical changes, but I thought I'd review them with you before we made those changes and submitted to the General Assembly. And then the final thing is on the guideline form itself. One of the things that we had was the type of case. And we had listed as the type of case V for violent, NV for not violent, and RRI for recidivism risk reduction incentive. But when we talk to the parole board and we're trying to align what we're doing with what they're doing, their type of case is instead majority case, where a majority of the parole board members have to vote on the case. Panel case, where it's like 2 members of the board have to vote on the case, or triple RI. So we just want to align the categories we're using with theirs so that we're just on the same page. So these are minor changes, but again, they're different than what we published in, for the public hearings and what the commission adopted. So I wanted to just make sure there weren't any concerns or questions about that. As I said, I reviewed it with Professor Mystic. These are technical changes, but I wanted to at least bring it to your attention. So unless you have any concerns, I will be, submitting this in the next week or two to the General Assembly through the bulletin. They'll have a 90-day review period, and we anticipate that everything will go into effect January 1st of next year for the parole guidelines. I am also meeting with the parole board next month during their retreat, and we're spending a whole morning reviewing the parole guidelines and then working on the recommitment ranges, because at the last meeting, the commission tabled the recommitment ranges. And part of that was trying to figure out, what do you do with new conviction offenses? What do you do with some of the technical stuff? And there were some concerns raised by the commission, and I think that we can just do better than what we have right now. So I'm going to be meeting with the parole board. So I'm hoping that for the December meeting, in addition to having the draft sentencing guidelines, you'll also have draft parole recommitment ranges. And then the final thing, and the chair and I talked about this, one of the other things that we want to consider along with our sentencing guidelines are our resentencing guidelines for probation violations. And we heard a lot of public comment about some of the work we did on looking at technical violations of probation linked to drug dependency. And so I know the chair has had meetings and discussions with others. We've talked about it as part of the Vital Strategies project we did. And we heard some of that during public testimony about thinking in terms of recommendations for drug dependent offenders. And so one of the things we'll look at for coming up with the draft resentencing guidelines to be consistent with the sentencing guidelines is trying to incorporate some of that and giving you that draft during the December meeting as well. So mark your calendar, December meeting, that Wednesday, sentencing guidelines 8th edition, resentencing guidelines to go with the 8th edition, and parole recommitment ranges. 3 drafts that we'll be reviewing, anticipating that on that Thursday, December meeting, we will ask you to approve those public hearings early next year. And with that, I think we are done with the policy meeting. I know the judge had mentioned that we take a little break before we get started, so I'll turn it back to the judge for closing this meeting and taking a break until the start of the commission meeting.
We are closing this meeting, taking a break. So we're gonna take a 10-minute stretch, hopefully, and then be back at what, 11:20?
11:20 is when we'll start the commission meeting.
Okay,
Thank
thank you,
you.
everybody. Hey, Mark, do we?
We do because we have a tracking. Is Judge Tucker on? Yeah, there he is. And is Senator Street?
No, I don't see it.
Staff.
Okay, we definitely have the forms, so. Have at it.
Just all set?
Oh, Christie, are we recording? Great, thank you.
All right, we will call the quarterly meeting of the Commission on Sentencing to order. Start by moving over to Professor Mystic for an announcement regarding the executive session.
Thank you, Chairman. During our last regular public meeting, it was a special public meeting, actually, on July the 28th, the chair announced that the commission will be going into executive session at some future date in order to discuss personnel matters. On August 15th, that executive session took place, and personnel matters were the topic of that meeting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Next, we'll open it up to any comments. Are there any public comments that you guys are seeing online?
If anybody does want to give public comment, they can raise their hand in Zoom.
We don't know if anybody is scheduled to.
Yeah, nobody
Okay.
is scheduled to. Nobody is raising their hands, so,
Somebody chimes in, please let us know.
okay.
Happy to hear any public comments. We'll move on to approval of the minutes from the June 2nd quarterly meeting. Is there a motion? Is there a second?
Second.
All right, it's been moved and seconded to approve the minutes of the June 2nd, 2022 quarterly meeting. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. I guess I went out of order.
That's all right.
Might have been my fault, Chairman.
Either way. So I think you covered the August 15th meeting. Mark, is there anything regarding the July 28th meeting that we need to discuss?
No, this morning we discussed the this morning during our policy meeting and yesterday as well, we discussed the revisions of the sentencing guidelines, the preparation towards the 8th edition guidelines, and that was the subject of the July 28th meeting as well.
All right, we'll move on to the executive, administrative, and financial segment of the meeting. We are sad to, we are sad as a commission, but certainly happy for Judge Tucker, who has announced his retirement. And Judge, I know, I think I mentioned this to you before. Before we met, I had the opportunity to practice before your wife in federal court, and thought the world of her. And after having had the opportunity to work with you for the last couple of years, you know, just the two of you are just remarkable people who've dedicated yourself so much to public service, and your contributions here to the commission have just been outstanding and terrific. And I know I tasked you with working with that group of academics with historically Black colleges and universities, and the work product there was tremendous. So I just wanted to personally thank you for your contributions here to the Commission on Sentencing, and wish you well on your retirement. We do have a plaque here. I don't know, it's a little, I don't know how to put it so that you can see it, but we'll be sending it to you. But I certainly want to open the floor up to any other commission members who might want to offer remarks as well. Anybody else have anything to add?
Pleasure serving with Judge Tucker. It was always insightful, but all his experience to us here in the commission really gave us some good insights on the issues in Philadelphia that otherwise we wouldn't have had. So it's a pleasure working with him.
Super grateful for all of the extra time. Sometimes you hear quarterly, you do a meeting, you come in before, and to get involved as you did and with the academic group, and the tremendous amount of hours you put in, and the fruitfulness of all of that was just invaluable. So thank you. We will miss you. It's been a pleasure.
And Judge Tucker, Judge Daly, I will echo everyone else's thoughts and enjoyed working with you. And also your insight on the juvenile justice system was very helpful. And as Judge Marsko indicated, coming from Philadelphia County, you certainly brought a great perspective to the Sentencing Commission. So you'll be missed. Thank you.
Judge, did you want to offer any comments?
I'll just say thank you very much for those kind words. It really was an excellent experience. Having been on the bench for about 17 years and in the district attorney's office for about 5 years and in private practice for about 25 years. A lot of this work that I've done was centered around criminal law. But I never really thought that much about what the commission does. And when the Chief Justice appointed me, I just thought this was just going to be another committee where we sat around and talked and moved on. But this committee is one of the hardest working committees that I've ever been a part of. And the staff is just so enlightful in terms of the things they do, the information they gather, ferret out everything and put it together in such an understanding way that it really is appreciative in terms of me, at least anyway. And candidly, I do not think that most of the judges throughout the Commonwealth who practice or who sit in criminal court have a clue as to the depth of what this commission does and how it's presented and the effect that it has on the work that they do. So again, thank you very much for those kind words, and I appreciate the friendship, the camaraderie, the thoughts that we've shared the short time that I was on the committee, and I wish you all well. Thank you again.
Thanks so much, Judge.
Hey, Rep. This is Rep. Krajewski. I just wanted to really quickly chime in and say some words. I just want to thank you, Judge, for a lot of the support you gave me as a new incoming commission member, particularly, both of us coming from Philadelphia. Being able to just talk with you and get to learn the ropes and a lot of the advice you were willing to share with me was really helpful. So I look forward to staying connected and wishing you the best in a much deserved retirement.
Thank you very much.
Judge, this is Mark Bergstrom. First, I want to echo everyone else's thanks to you for all of your work, especially the academic review panel and then your assistance in helping us to foster a new relationship, particularly with the Lincoln University. That's been incredibly helpful to the commission, and I just appreciate all of your efforts. I do have in my possession this plaque, so I'm going to be in Philly the next couple of weeks, so I'm going to try to see if I can stop by to drop it off. Otherwise, I'll have to trust the U.S. Postal Service, and I'll try to arrange with you to get it to you one way or the other. So thank you again.
Yeah, don't trust the U.S. Postal Service, please. Matter of fact, they're having hearings on them yesterday over at Temple. So I'll make myself available to receive the plaque.
Then I'll try to schedule a time to drop it off. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
All right. Well, I know we're going to miss Judge Tucker for sure, but we already have a new appointment to fill his shoes. So Judge McDermott, also from Philadelphia, who I know joined us yesterday for the discussion. And is she online here too now?
She is online.
Okay.
Yep.
Perfect. So welcome, Judge. We look forward to working with you on the commission, and they're big shoes to fill, but I'm confident you'll be just fine and make several contributions as Judge Tucker has. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. And I know where to find Leon. So, I know I have big shoes to fulfill. And if he's not available, I can get the plaque to him. Mark knows. I don't know where he lives, but I know I could find out where he lives. So
Well, we appreciate that.
Thank you, Judge.
We'll move on to ex officio agency updates. Mark did send out the 2022 DOC recidivism report. I know I haven't had a chance to review it.
Right,
Judge
but-
Bernstein probably has read it 14 times.
And Dr. Brett Buckland from DOC is with us, and he can give a brief summary of the report and the work of the DOC.
All right.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Can you hear me?
We can. Good morning, Brett.
Thanks for giving me just a moment to share our report. We're pretty excited about it. It was a large effort. It's a 58-page report, jam-packed with a bunch of recidivism statistics in it. The last time we did a report like this was back in 2013. And this report we actually started 2 years ago, right before COVID in 2020. So it's been a long time coming to get this report out, a large group effort on the part of the research staff here at DOC. And we think it's going to create a lot of discussion and just has a lot of really good statistics in it. I'll just hit some of the highlights of it. Of course, we update our recidivism number every year, but this goes way beyond just one or two recidivism numbers. We look at recidivism from a number of different angles in this report. And as you might expect in any large report like this, we're looking at recidivism from a number of different angles. There's going to be some bad news and there's going to be some good news. So it really is a mixed bag in terms of recidivism performance and some of the outcomes that are measured in the report. First, I guess I'll give you the bad news from the report. So when we define recidivism, we define our one overall recidivism number as the first incident of either rearrest or reincarceration in a DOC facility within 3 years after release. So that's our main definition, although we have a number of different ways of measuring recidivism in this report that we look at. That's our one consistently main definition. And we look at that, it remains quite high. So about 2/3, 64%, meet that definition of recidivism. About 2/3 are going to either be rearrested or reincarcerated within 3 years after release. And one thing we did in this report too was also adjust that for the fact that, and this is something new that we haven't done before, adjusted for the fact that we know that some of our individuals get out and recidivate in other states, and that's typically not picked up in our recidivism. So they may go to, New Jersey, New York, when neighboring state, get arrested. We typically don't pick that up because we get our arrest records from PA State Police. So we have a new estimate in this report for out-of-state recidivism. And when we look at that and we combine that, that 64% actually goes up to 72% within 3 years after release. So that's really quite high. And then if we follow individuals 10 years after release, that goes up even further to 80% or higher. So, the recidivism rate remains quite high. And also I would say that we found in the report, the recidivism rates have remained pretty consistent over a 15-year period. So there haven't been a lot of drops or increases one way or the other. We looked at recidivism measured by a number of different ways. So we looked at reincarceration, we looked at rearrest, we looked at a reconviction, at least 3 or 4 different definitions. And when we plot that over a 15-year period, it's pretty flat. It hasn't substantially decreased or increased one way or the other. We also estimated that about 1 in 10 of all arrests that happen in Pennsylvania are of someone that would previously had spent time in DOC. So that's also a pretty, impressive number that, 1 out of every 10 encounters that the police have where an arrest is made is of an individual that had spent time before in the DOC. And then there's the cost aspect. We have a whole section on the cost of recidivism in the report. And for the first time, we've tried to estimate using some national estimates of the cost of crime, especially a study that was done by the Rand Institute. We've estimated that recidivism cost Pennsylvanians about $3.1 billion per year. That's not just the cost of corrections. That's the cost of police. That's the cost of the courts. That's victim cost. There's all the costs that are associated with crime. When you look at those costs and then look at the number of recidivism incidents that happen in Pennsylvania in a year, the estimated cost is about $3.1 billion. So that's the bad news. Some of the more positive findings in the report, one thing that we looked at was that standard 2/3 recidivism rate that's quoted often, that I mentioned up front. Some academics have started to point to that and say that that is a bit misleading because of the way that that is calculated. And the way that that is standardly calculated is by starting with individuals who are released from prison and following them for a period after prison. The problem with that is that release groups from prison overrepresent repeat offenders, churners. And so one example I think we give in the report that I like to give is, think about if we were doing a customer satisfaction survey of Target shoppers online Target shoppers. And so every time you went on Target's website, a survey popped up. The problem with that is that we know that there are people that like to shop at Target a whole lot. And so the survey results are going to be overrepresented by those repeat Target shoppers. Similarly, the way that we traditionally calculate recidivism, it overrepresents repeat offenders, and it's not representative of the whole population that has spent some amount of time in the Department of Corrections. And so this is all academic, but when we adjust for this, then it looks like the recidivism rate drops back down from about 2/3 to about half, to about 50%. So still quite high, but lower than the traditional measures of recidivism. And neither are right or wrong. It's just different ways of looking at recidivism. We also tried to compare to the national average. The DOJ has issued several recidivism reports, the latest of which included 30 states in their recidivism estimates. So we tried to match their methodology. And when we do that for an apples to apples comparison, it looks like Pennsylvania is slightly below the national average. So that's a positive thing, that even if we're high, we are less high than the rest of the country, I guess. We're below the national average. Another encouraging thing is that for the first time, we're seeing racial disparities in recidivism eliminated. So historically, we saw about a 10 to 12 percentage point difference in race categories. And now the recidivism rates for example, for whites and blacks are essentially the same, equal in this report. So we're seeing, some reduction in racial disparities. We're also seeing some reduction in the seriousness of recidivism. So one way to measure this that we looked at in the report was the average offense gravity score for a recidivism incident, for all the recidivism incidents. And when we look at an old cohort, an old group of recidivists and a recent group of recidivists, it looks like the average offense gravity score is on average is lower more recently. And so that's a positive. Even if the recidivism rate hasn't changed, the seriousness seems to have been reduced in the recidivism incidents. And then the last thing that we looked at was we tried to introduce in this report a new concept called desistance. And this is another area where academics are talking a lot about this, but it hasn't really filtered down to the policy maker level yet. So, we spent probably the last 20 years just trying to get people familiar with the term recidivism, and it's even a hard term to pronounce. And now we're trying to introduce this new word, desistance. And in the crudest sense, desistance is really just the flip of recidivism. It's what makes people succeed. So recidivism is, what's the failure rate? Desistance is looking at success rates after prison, the flip side of that. And we looked at 3 different measures of desistance. We looked at deceleration, which is the rate at which people offend. Do they get arrested? So we found, for instance, before prison, they get arrested 7 times on average in a 10-year period before prison. And after prison, they get arrested about 2.5 times in the 10-year period after prison. So there seems to be a deceleration in the rate of offending, even if by a binary number, it's pass fail, they're failing at a lower rate. So that was deceleration. We looked at de-escalation, which again ties into the offense gravity score, and that's the seriousness of the types of recidivism. And that seems to be decreasing as well, as I mentioned. And then just cessation, which is those who stop, and we estimate about 20% stop altogether. So they're going to be released and never ever do anything again. And when we combine those three measures, what we find is that about 90% of those released meet one or more of those benchmarks of success. Either they slow down, they commit less serious offenses, or they stop altogether. So that paints a different picture than the 2/3 recidivism rate. It's a different way of looking at it, but it paints a different picture. So that was another main contribution, I think. There's a lot more that I won't go over the rest of it. Encourage you to take a look at it. We look at recidivism by demographics, by individual characteristics, by whether they have a substance use problem, whether they have a mental health problem, their education level. We also look at, for the first time, recidivism rates by individual prisons or state correctional institutions, as well as individual parole districts and areas of the state. And then we do have a page in the report where we summarize some of the program evaluation results most recently of programs intended to reduce recidivism and what some of those programs have found. So a lot of conversation starters with the report, we hope, a lot of information, and we're not trying to draw any policy conclusions from the report. We're really just presenting the numbers and offering it to a wide group of audiences, and hope that it will inform policy discussions going forward. So thank you so much for the opportunity to just give an overview. And again, please reach out if you have any questions on the report, and I hope you enjoy it.
Thanks, Brett. I just want to make sure I wrote something down correctly. So did you say that it's north of 80% of DOC individuals are rearrested or reincarcerated within 10 years?
That's correct, yes.
All right. Well, I appreciate the information and certainly look forward to taking a deep dive into that report.
Thanks.
Any other questions while we're here? Professor Rego?
Just quick, first of all, thank you. It's a remarkable report, and you don't have to answer this now, but I'm just wondering generally, is there any county-specific lessons that could be drawn from this report? I'm sure the folks in Allegheny would be, and other counties, I'm sure, would be very interested in taking some lessons from this report. But is there anything county-specific do you think we could take from this, or is it still the big picture?
I would say it's mostly the big picture, although we do have recidivism rates by county, by committing county, the county that sentenced to DOC. And if you look at that map, what it seems to look like to me is that the central and western counties have higher recidivism rates than the eastern counties.
Interesting. Great
But
stuff.
there's a map in the report that shows recidivism rates shaded by each of the 67 counties, so you can see the darker shaded counties have higher rates. Later
Thank you for that. We were joking amongst the judges here about who was considered east and west and who's got the higher recidivism rates. But we'll look at the report and we'll have some more commentary to follow. I have a follow-up question. Does anyone do this type of a report for the counties? And, taking a look at recidivism rates at county jails?
Yeah, we haven't, but we talked yesterday about how difficult it is to do these studies and how it's going to be improved because of some of the work that is done with PSP. But it's really difficult to compile and analyze this. But some jails, I think, have done it.
Yeah. Our struggle historically has also been what the release date from the local jails are. So if you remember for the VUFA study, we're using the minimum sentence as our proxy just because we don't know if they're going back in and out or how that works. So obviously at the DOC level, we have more granular and reliable and valid information on entrance and exit dates from the institutions.
To the chairman's point, I think there's high value for the counties, but I hesitate to share it with all of our stakeholders because they may jump to conclusions that aren't ripe yet. But it's a great report, and I do look forward to sharing it with some of our stakeholders here.
Thanks.
All right. Moving on to the Board of Probation and Parole. I don't know if Chairman Johnson is with us.
I don't see him, but as I mentioned earlier, I know they have a retreat, their retreat scheduled, annual retreat scheduled next month. And I've been invited to participate in that retreat, and that'll be an opportunity to review both the parole guidelines and work on the recommitment ranges with the board.
All right. Move along to the executive director's report.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be sending some of this back to you pretty quickly for some action items, but I did want to mention that in the materials and during the discussions yesterday, during the annual planning meeting, we talked about some of the reorganization of commission staff, and particularly around the executive unit. So sort of redefining my position a bit and then creating a second deputy director position. So effectively, the commission will have two divisions, with one division that focuses on overseeing the research unit and the SGS Web application development unit, and the other deputy or division focusing on sort of the administration of the commission and education and outreach. So one of the efforts in developing the new MOU with Penn State was to articulate those three positions and then to put in place procedures for the commission to select an individual for the second deputy director position, and then to make sure all three of those executive unit positions would be appointed as clinical faculty members of Penn State, and then that the commission would be positioned to be able to determine which of those two deputies would be the senior deputy director in case the executive director is not present to sign off on things and so forth, and then also to designate a salary for each of those within the salary band that was approved. So all of those procedural things have been put in place and approved as part of the renewed MOU during the June meeting. And so now, as Professor Mystic said, the commission met in executive session to discuss some of this, and I'm going to turn it back to the chairman because there are three action items. First is the selection of an individual as deputy director for administration and outreach. Second is the designation of a senior deputy director. And the third is the assignment of salaries for those two positions.
So just to share with the group and the public, we, the vice chair and I and the executive director received, some resumes. We actually thought that the number of resumes was fairly sparse initially, so we went back out and sought some additional resumes, and then got really a more robust sampling, I guess, of folks that were interested in the deputy director position. We whittled that down to 5 interviews we conducted, for three interviews we conducted. I'll let the judge share her thoughts and Mark as well. But one of the things, this is a pretty unique position requiring a fairly unique blend of skills and education and experience. And while there were some applicants, in my opinion, who may have excelled in one of those areas, they had a great educational background or some experience with some aspects of the job. There was really only one applicant in my mind who really fit the criteria that we were looking for, who had the requisite education and experience, and met those qualifications, and that was Ryan Myers. So I think when you looked at these candidates, some of them were very impressive, and actually some of them may fit other roles here within the commission. I mean, one of the things that we did discuss is hanging on to some of these resumes because there certainly were some impressive folks participating. But when you look at the specific skill set that this position requires, and with Ryan's blend of experience here at the commission and the education that he has, and frankly, in my mind, he's demonstrated, certainly his capabilities to fill this role. I didn't think there was any real question that, in my mind, Ryan would be the appropriate applicant, or the appropriate individual to fill the position. I don't know if you guys have anything additional to add.
Well, anybody who's part of this commission at any level understands the learning curve when you hop on, the complexity of everything involved. So when we were looking for individuals, we were trying to find somebody who's familiar with teaching and the educational aspect, has experience running those sides of things, but also someone who had a command of the sentencing guidelines. And even for lower level, for bringing in people who are doing some of the different trainings, who've had years of calculations, there was a learning curve. And there was really nobody who applied who on the sentencing side had much more than that broad understanding you have when you're looking at the matrix. And Ryan's just, it's very hard to have anything that's going to come close to 10 years of experience in the depths that he has. We wanted to make sure we casted it as wide net as possible, which is why when we had a low amount of applicants, we then republicized it, but went to multiple other areas to get. And the reason you may wonder if we had 9 and then we had 3 additional, but there were certain things that we all talked about that we thought if they don't have these certain things, it's not worth doing a face-to-face interview, because just on paper alone, that's really, it just doesn't rise to the level of what we were looking for. So that's why we whittled it down to just 3 people that we did face-to-face with. But it's, if you didn't know anybody, which we did, we knew Ryan, but if you had known none of them, you just cited in his interview, I would say the legal term is, blew it out of the water, like he just, that's Latin. So, yeah, so I just don't think there's a comparison. And I do agree, boy, if any of these people have some interest in other positions, should they come available here, they were. And some people are doing some really neat things in the roles that they're in right now. That in fact, is one of them I think we could learn a lot from, and something that they're doing in the county here in Pennsylvania. But so, yeah, I kind of, reiterating a lot, but I think it's important to make a record for the public who's a part of this as to the depth we went to make sure we looked far and wide. But I just don't think the commission would be any better served than it would be if we had Ryan Myers take the deputy director position for the outreach and education.
Yeah, just a handful of comments, but it echoes what the chairman and vice chairman said about these other candidates. They were impressive candidates. I mean, on paper, but also during interviews, everyone brought something to the table, a real strength in an area, either practice or understanding of criminal law, or of the administration of the courts, or of teaching in a college setting, or at least familiarity with the guidelines. But as the judge said, there was just a huge divide in terms of working knowledge of the guidelines, sort of the stuff we went through the last 2 days that was painful, but someone that knew and could work with that and could lead that effort, which is what's required as the deputy director. I think that was a key thing. But the other point is, should Ryan get this position, then there is the manager position of education and outreach, where some of these individuals had great qualifications. There's an open policy position with the commission there. So I think, as the judge said, we saw some great individuals, and we reviewed some great candidates. And I hope that some of these individuals are in the mix as we move forward on other positions, because they would help to build out the quality of the staff of the commission. So with that, I'll turn it back to the chair, because we have to go through the formal process.
So I think we need a motion to, is it appoint, hire, designate?
Select. I think is the word.
Select deputy director, judge.
So I would motion to select Ryan Myers as the deputy director of administration and outreach.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the motion? All right, it's been moved and seconded to select Ryan Myers as the deputy director for administration and outreach. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed? That's all the time I'll do. All right. I assume that they were a unanimous vote in favor. Ryan, congratulations. Motion passes. All right. Now along, that would leave now 2 deputy directors. Mark, I don't know if you want to talk about this or not, but we thought it was important to designate one of you as the senior deputy director.
Yeah, and this is just, as I said before, when I'm not available, but there are things to be signed or decisions to be made, there needs to be a default. And it was pretty easy when there was one deputy to say who that was. So Matt's done a great job of that for 3 years or whatever now. But now that there's 2 deputies, it's important under our new procedures to designate one as the senior deputy director. And so I very much encourage consideration of Matt because of his experience and his time with the commission.
Yeah, so I shared in that belief. I think Matt's done a terrific job. As the chair, I get to work with Mark and Matt on a lot of these issues on a more day-to-day basis, but certainly Matt is very well familiar and acquainted with the commission and has done terrific work. So I would agree with the executive director's recommendation there.
Sure. I didn't have one, Mike, because I agree with all of what you said. All right, so I would make a motion to designate Matthew Kleinman as the senior deputy director of the commission.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, any discussion? Moved and seconded to designate Matthew Kleinman as the senior deputy director of the Sentencing Commission. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, the ayes have it. Congratulations. And now, moving on to the salaries. Mark, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so let me just give myself some sheet. There we go. When we restructured the executive unit and we worked on the job descriptions and the salary bands for approval or review by Penn State, what we looked at were comparable positions and salaries and other legislative and Commonwealth agencies and the existing salaries that we had in place. And the commission decided that there would be 3 salary bands for the executive branch or the executive unit. The first for the executive director would be 130,000 to 150,000 as far as the band. For the senior deputy director, the band would be 120,000 to 140,000. And for the deputy director position, it would be 110 to 130,000. So with those in place, and now with the designation of a deputy director, senior deputy director, I'll turn it back to the chair and the vice chair for specific recommendations regarding salaries within those bands.
Yes, my recollection is we discussed the fact that we didn't want to start at the bottom because of their experience level. And there was some calculation we did, and whenever there's numbers and calculations, I want to say it's 3.5.
Right. I think the discussion was, as the judge said, that based on the qualifications and the experience with the commission, the base of both of those ranges, so 110,000 and 120,000, was below what seemed appropriate. And I think we had, I think some of the members of the commission during the executive session talked about percentage increases above that would represent their experience and their contributions to the commission. So I think that formed the recommendation regarding salaries.
All right, so is there a motion concerning the salaries for the senior deputy director and the deputy director?
Yeah, I would make a motion for the approval of the salary of the senior deputy director in the amount of $125,100, and also an approval of the salary of the deputy director of $112,800. Can we do those collectively in one motion? Okay.
All right, is there a second? All right, is there any discussion?
Who was the second?
Judge
Marsico. All right, it's been moved and seconded to set the salary for the senior deputy director at $125,100 and the deputy director at $112,800. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Congratulations, gentlemen. Well deserved on both counts. All right, moving on to.
I can move through.
Yeah,
these
go ahead.
other issues if you'd like. Okay, so just a couple of report issues. Brett will talk later about the recent hire of a new research analyst to fill out his unit. So he can report on that later. Under management and oversight, we talked yesterday about the staff organization. So check the record on that if you'd like. It's we'll have it out on YouTube too. But we have 3 vacant positions now, and so we'll be working on trying to post and fill those. Moving through the management and oversight, otherwise, no changes on diversity, equity, and inclusion, although I have had some contact with Lincoln University to try to look for opportunities to engage with them during this fall semester. Moving on to fiscal issues, the first is an action item, and all the materials are in the documents that we provided. But the first is a closeout of the 2021-2022 budget. Jake Dean has completed those, and the materials are found in your the documents are found in your materials. With the closeout of the budget, we also would initiate the audit of that year. And you may recall that several years ago, we did a 3-year contract with Boyer and Ritter. We've done that for 2 years so far. So this is the third of those reviews. So we're asking for a motion to approve the closeout of the 2021 budget and the notification of Boyer and Ritter to initiate the audit.
Is there a motion?
So moved.
Is there a second? Anyone?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to close out the fiscal year 2021-22 budget and notify Boyer and Ritter to begin the audit. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed? The ayes have it.
And then some of these are just rote kind of discussions, but based on the appropriation we received, which is the 5.333 million, and the JRI2 appropriation, we have put together the operating budget for fiscal year 2022-2023. We had a draft of this during the June meeting that was approved, so this is just an update of that. One notice that I'll make, as I mentioned yesterday, the JRI funding is dependent on the cost savings to the DOC, and because of COVID, population's down, the cost savings are also down, or at least the cost savings attributed to JRI2. And so while we are authorized to receive up to $400,000, what we received in our appropriation was $152,000. So it is a shortfall of several $100,000. Fortunately, we did have some surplus, so we rolled that into our sort of savings, and we'll be using that as needed. But I think we built a budget based on what was appropriated, and so that's what's before you for approval as our operating budget.
Mark, just a quick correction. You said 5.22.
Yeah.
It said
5.3 and
it's not
5.2.
2 points.
2 point. Oh yeah. Sorry. It's like the General Assembly would like to give us 5. Yeah. No, $2.533 million. Thank you. But hopeful.
I have
So
a
a motion.
I have a question real quick, and I don't know, is Brett still on?
Yes.
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, Brett, have you guys done, has DOC done any work to try to guess where those JRI funds might end up this year? I mean, have you done any analysis in that regard to see whether we'll be back on track?
Well, the numbers are actually looking good. Part of the reason why we haven't seen the savings is because the larger savings are dependent upon actually closing a facility. When you get to that large of a savings, and there hasn't been a closing of a facility yet. So until that happens, we're not, even with the numbers up, we're saving at marginal cost, which is only about $30 a day. So, you know, when you close a prison, you get a lot more cost savings. And that's really what it's contingent upon. But the numbers, like for instance, state drug treatment program, the numbers are up about, I think 15 to 20%. So it seems to be tracking in a good direction with the numbers. It's just dependent on the decisions made in terms of facility closings.
So at this point, we shouldn't really bank on the 400,000 for next year either. Or for this year either, I guess. Is it a safe assumption?
I would say so, yeah.
Okay.
And that's one of the issues we raised both under JRI 1 and 2, that you know, our state appropriation is really what we look for stable funding for ongoing operations. And you know, we saw the JRI 2 funds as to support the rebuilding of SGS Web, and certainly needed for that. We do have some savings, so that's helpful, but it is one of those concerns that if we're building a budget around funds that are not stable, that can create a problem. And I think it's something we have to look at for the upcoming state appropriation thereon, because we'll start dipping into some of that for operating costs, and I think that creates a little bit of a problem.
All right, so then I know the notes here indicate approval of any modifications to the 2022-23 operating budget. There are none, right?
Well,
Or is that the change?
there is a modification because during June, we authorized a preliminary budget, so we need we took into account the end of year adjustments to each of the line items. So we modified it to accommodate the new budget. So we do need approval for modifications.
And at that point in June, we didn't know what the ending carryover would be for the fiscal year. Now we have firm numbers. We know we're carrying over from previous appropriations. If you look at the bottom, it's like $574,000 to add to the total budget. So the operating budget is less than what we proposed because of some salaries that weren't being funded, you know, during this time. But we have that listed as, you know, unbudgeted funds, so that we have more funds available than we will expend, but we don't know what's going to come up now.
Right. All right, is there a motion to modify the 2022-2023 operating budget as provided for in the material as detailed by Mark? So moved, Jake. Is there a second?
Second.
Right. It's been moved and seconded to approve modifications to the 2022-2023 operating budget. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it.
Right, and two other quick items. These are service purchase contracts. As you know, on generally an annual basis, we identify a student at Duquesne Law to work with Professor Mystic on providing legal research. In working with Professor Mystic, we've identified a student, Christopher Gowan, and we've identified some key projects for this year because we're trying to document some of and have a review of our personnel policies for commission staff and our operating procedures. And so we wanted to take a sort of a second look at all of those, and we think this student is the right student for it. So I'm requesting a service purchase contract in an amount not to exceed $5,000 for over the course of the next fiscal year. And it would be at a rate of $25 an hour, which is what we provide for legal research at Duquesne, and all work product and the hours would be approved by and supervised by Professor Mystic.
Is there a motion to approve the service purchase contract?
Who made the motion?
Judge Burstein. And second?
Second.
All right. Any discussion? It's been moved and seconded to approve service purchase contract with Christopher Gowan in the amount not to exceed $1,000 to provide legal research. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it.
And the final one is a service purchase contract with a student at Villanova Law for a continuation of a research project Connor Mock, for an amount not to exceed $3,500.
Is there a motion? Judge Down. Seconded.
Second.
All right, Professor Rego. It's been moved and seconded to approve a service purchase contract with Connor Mock at Villanova University in the amount of not to exceed $3,500 for research internship. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it.
All right, great, thank you. Now we'll turn to Matt for the deputy director's report, for a deputy director's report. At least senior deputy director.
We're wondering if we're like attorneys general.
Yeah.
But we'll talk about that later.
Good, deputies. I like that.
So a number of the staffing issues we discussed yesterday, just about future projects and the roles, but I just wanted to note again that we're welcoming 2 visiting scholars to replace our previous visiting scholars starting October 3rd. The Christopher Thomas and you do. One will be our postdoctoral scholar in racial and ethnic fairness, which will continue to be a big part of our research agenda, is overlaying and making sure we pay particular attention to any disparities that come out in policies and practices and programs that we evaluate. Also mentioned yesterday that we're continuing our work with Reese Hester at Clemson University as a visiting scholar, and his insights and experience with prior record score and guideline construction, especially as it relates to the 8th edition guidelines. And we're welcoming Dr. Laura Beckman from Shippensburg University as our second visiting scholar. And I think that, consistent with yesterday, just to reiterate some of the kind of overarching themes of the research that these folks will be assisting with, is focus on racial and ethnic fairness, some of this work on cost benefit analysis that we've talked about for programs statewide, but part of our evaluations also locally. And then a particular emphasis, I think, in this coming fiscal year on these contextual and local policies and practices, which I think gets a little bit to what Professor Rego asked in the previous session, just about areas that we may be able to focus on regarding localities at the county level or across counties and regions. Related to the research partnership, I just want to make a sad note that I would like to note the passing of a former professor who worked with the commission for many years, Dr. Barry Rubeck, who is a professor of criminology and sociology. He's beyond serving as an advisor for many of the graduate students who were graduate students here at the commission. He worked on a number of projects, including the development of the risk assessment tool, and a project I noted yesterday on fines, fees, and restitutions. So I'd just like to turn it over to Mark.
Sure. This was a shocking loss over the summer. It was unexpected, and Barry was, worked with the commission, I think, for 10 years or more. He was an incredible researcher, and he was a great mentor for students that we had as grad assistants, but in the program generally. And he was, so it's great loss. And it's also, he did, like Matt said yesterday, some really incredible work on looking at victim issues and looking particularly at victim restitution, but restitution as part of other economic sanctions. And he was sort of ahead of the curve on this stuff, because he was our first embedded academic partner with the research partnership. John Kramer had been executive director. He sort of, when he transitioned over past the commission, he was our first academic partner, but Barry was the first one, from the department, and stayed in that position for quite a long period of time. And again, worked in this area that I think the commission said, well, that's an interesting area, but it wasn't like a high priority. And in the end, it became really important. I mean, first, to take into account in a really deep and meaningful way research into victimization, and then to think about things like restitution as part of the whole structure. And it was not only helpful to the commission and to the field, but it also informed the General Assembly and courts in their operations. So anyhow, it's a great loss, but it's also one of those things that I think the commission could be proud of developing a partnership with Penn State and having the ability to take that that caliber of a person to work not only with commission staff, but also with the students that we have working for us. So, so thanks for the opportunity to just mention something about that.
Send our condolences.
Okay, my, excuse me, my final item relates to an opportunity that presented itself to me and Mark, where we received an inquiry from folks at the United Nations Development Program to host a delegation from Kosovo. And Kosovo is currently working on developing some guidelines, especially as they relate to corruption. And they were really interested in the governance and operation of the Pennsylvania Commission on Sentencing, interested in the training that's provided to judges about guidelines, and interested in SGS Web and our data and the way that we assemble the data and collect the data, interested in our research capacity and the way that we translate and use that to inform practices, but also to review and think about the guidelines themselves by referencing the data. So very briefly, I've been working with Mark on coming up with the agenda for this, and there's three components of this. The first will be a meeting with commission staff at Villanova University Law School, where our former chair, Professor Steve Chanitson, will also be meeting with us, talking about those specifics that I just laid out, from training to data to governance, etc. The second component will be a visit to the Montgomery County Court of Common Pleas, where Judge Carpenter has agreed to be sort of our point person. We'll be attending a sentencing hearing and then meeting with some district attorneys, defense, and the judge over a lunch session to talk about a number of policies and how guidelines are considered prior to sentencing, what information is given to the judge, and et cetera. And then finally, there'll be a visit to the United States Sentencing Commission, where they'll be meeting with Sentencing Commission staff, but also with Chief Judge Beryl Howell of the United States District Court of the District of Columbia. Again, attending a sentencing hearing, but hearing how they use the federal guidelines. And I just want to note quickly that it's a small delegation, but it's a very impressive delegation that will be joining us. So we'll be joined by the president of the Supreme Court of Kosovo, by the president of the Basic Court of Pristina. Pristina is their capital city, so their largest jurisdiction, their largest court. The acting chief state prosecutor, a judge of the Court of Appeals, and then a legal officer from the Supreme Court, and two representatives from the United Nations Development Program. So I think it's a really wonderful opportunity and something I'm excited to be facilitating, but to take part in. And that is not next week, the following week. So,
and I want to thank Matt for all of his work on this. There's, as you can imagine, a lot of details involved. I mean, helping them to get visas and stuff like that to visit, but you know, a lot of planning. And we have joked a little bit, but we're partly serious about Matt having our international portfolio as part of his job. So maybe that's why he's now the senior deputy director, because he has to work in those international spaces.
Galactic.
Yeah. There we go. So thanks, Matt, for all your work on this.
Yeah, I mean, look, it speaks volumes, both Matt, to your work history and just the quality of the work that you do here, but I also think it speaks to the broader commission as a whole. I mean, that, you know, they're looking to you and to us to help guide them as they create this. So I think it's a real feather in the cap of the commission, and thank you for working to facilitate this for sure.
As we move to the rest of the agenda, we recognize that we had a pretty long meeting yesterday in terms of talking about each of the units. So there's no action items, so I'll just ask each of the unit managers to, you know, sort of briefly hit their areas and open up for any kind of discussion to the members. So you can quickly go through your agenda stuff, but no need to spend too much time. So,
well,
is that positive or negative?
I don't know. I have my notes here.
Oh, well,
I've got- I know I've
go
got a
through your-
condensed
Go
stuff.
through your notes. I just wanted
No,
to
I
take
can
pressure
skip
off. Yeah. Free form.
You want me to get started? Okay.
Sure, go ahead.
So I just wanted to review the progress on the SGS Web Next Gen project first. So as I discussed yesterday, we started working with JMT Technology Group back in May on the application design and architectural blueprint for the future state of SGS Web. They kind of broke it down into 3 tasks. So we started out by focusing on requirements and kind of expectations for the application. So we did a bunch of workshops, and if you're interested in kind of their findings from that, that's available in the supplemental materials on page 16. They've also been documenting any requirements that they uncovered in a tool called Azure DevOps, which we'll be able to use when we actually start building the application. The second task they focused on was information and system architecture. To this end, they created process flows for kind of all the processes that occur in SGS Web, like sentence guideline generation, sentence submission, revocation, resentencing. But then they also mapped out potential future process flows for parole guidelines, parole decision submission, and recommitment. So those are also available in the supplemental materials on starting on page 51. And then lastly, the other activity they completed was reviewing our technical architecture and proposing a new system architecture, which is also available in the materials on page 45. And the last task that they're currently working on is more focused on the user interface. So as I mentioned yesterday, they're creating a style guide and pattern library for our developers to use. And then they're also creating mock-ups of the future application. Our engagement with them will end in mid-November. So I will plan to share results and outputs maybe in that meeting, in our December meeting, sorry. And then the next phase would be for us to actually start building the application, which again, as I mentioned yesterday, we're going to start working on an RFP in order to find a vendor to help us with that. So I should have more information about that in our December meeting as well. And then, so that's really been our primary focus for the last few months. But we do continue to support and develop the existing version of SGS Web. So we did complete some enhancements to the database admin function, which will make our process easier and less error prone. And so those changes are going live next week. And then we worked on a handful of other issues and bugs reported by the users, but I won't go into the details. They're listed in the notebook materials if you're interested in the details. The only other thing I'll really mention is that, we have been working with the parole board staff to implement the interim parole guidelines, which are expected to go into effect January 1. And they're planning on implementing the parole guideline form in their on-base system and then export data to us. So we'll have to handle that manually at first, and then hopefully in the long term, we can automate a little bit more of it. And then since I always report about SGS Web usage, at the end of June, we had 51,000 sentences that had been submitted with 2022 dates of sentence. And just as a comparison, last year at this time, we only had 21,000. So you can see kind of the impact that COVID had and that we are recovering from it. That's it. Is that brief enough? Any questions?
First, that was exceptional. And secondly, I just wanted to take this moment to recognize Christy for having received her Master's of Software Engineering degree in August from Penn State. One of the great things about the affiliation with Penn State is that there are some benefits in terms of tuition discount, but there's also some opportunities for the commission to use our affiliation with Penn State to really encourage and support staff that want to continue their education, but also take advantage of being in a university town and using that as sort of staff development. So it's really this is just one of those examples where Christy took on all the work of it, but we're so proud of her to complete her degree in software engineering, which sounds pretty intimidating, but we think it's a good fit for Christy. And so congratulations, Christy.
Thank you. And I want to thank the commission as well, because in addition to the tuition discount we get, the commission, pays for that extra 25%. So supporting financially as well as, encouraging me to do it was great.
Thank you. All right. Next to Brett.
Yes, so I'm going to start by announcing the hiring of Ted Greenfelder as a research analyst for the commission. Ted was a former PhD candidate with Penn State's Criminology and Sociology department, and he'll continue working on that degree with us, finishing up his dissertation and utilizing that tuition discount through partnership with Penn State. And Ted has also been working for the last year for the state of New York, their Division of Criminal Justice. So he's got a lot of great experience and relevant work experience too that would help us out a lot. He'll be starting with us at the end of the month. At June's commission meeting, we presented our findings from our VUFA analysis for House Resolution 111. And just to recap, that was a 5-year study of firearms offenses from 2015 to 2020. And we took a deep dive into charging, prosecution, sentencing, and recidivism related to firearms offenses. Since that commission meeting, we finalized our report and submitted that to the House Judiciary Committee. So that full report is now available. As we mentioned yesterday, we plan to conduct some follow-up studies related to local jurisdictional differences that might have contributed to some of the results we found. We're wrapping up our analysis for the county certification of compliance. Again, this is where we report out to all of the counties on their rate of reporting for the previous year. Looks like 2021 was a strong year for reporting overall, with the overall rate above 95% for the year. Christy and I have collaborated to complete our data management plan. So again, as we've discussed previously, this is an update of all of our data sharing agreements, data management processes, and just sort of modernizing some of our processes as we move into this more virtual working world. I'm also working to complete a research plan that will, similar to what we discussed yesterday, will lay out all of the units projects along the timeline that focus on our specific areas of work that are laid out by our mandates. And finally, this fall, we'll be conducting an evaluation of the short sentence parole program at DOC, looking at admissions and cost benefit analysis and a short-term recidivism analysis, looking at the first few months from the first cohort of the program. So I think that wraps it up for me.
That sounds great. Thank you. And just one related item in close consultation with our chairman. On the HR 111 report, there's been an effort to try to arrange a presentation to the House Judiciary Committee. And it looks like we have a tentative date. So I'll be working with the two of you to try to make sure that we're available. I checked your calendar. You're good. So I'll have a date for you. So, we'll take it from there. Thank you, Brett. Any questions or comments for Brett? I think the final report out is, I think, from our new deputy director. So take whatever time you need.
You said briefly, you're the executive director, so I'll follow suit. Well, I think I just want to start by saying, like, thank you to the chair and vice chair for the interview, and certainly the kind words this morning. It means a lot to me. I appreciate that. And then thank you to the commission for giving me the opportunity to serve in this new capacity. And I certainly look forward to the transitions coming forth and all the work that comes with that.
I look forward to that too.
I think I was supposed to say look forward there, but no, I do. And I know there's a lot ahead of us, and I hope I can provide some stability to those transition periods. Thank you. And I guess then, to be brief on the update, because we spent so much time on it yesterday, in your highlight packet, page 45 to 48, are the pieces of information that you see on the screen with a little extra detail. And then if you want more detail in the supplemental materials, page 98 through page 151. And I think the summary here, and I'll see how brief I can be, is that the takeaway just that the unit engaging with counties to support accurate application of the guidelines. And as Brett just noted and Christy mentioned, timely submission of information to the commission. And so really what you see on the front half or the top half of this slide is all the work the unit does. And I have to commend all the members of the unit. We have some newer ones, but I'd like to just say Jen Hutton, Maria Jello, Tom Backus, and a newer member, Tiffany Smith, and then obviously Jawan Mitchell in the communication space, because they do a lot of heavy lifting here, and I get the privilege of reporting out on it. So I appreciate all their efforts. And then the second part of the slide is really just about some of those outreach efforts that we talked about yesterday in detail. How do we communicate the work of the commission and keep practitioners across the state apprised of all of the work and the decisions that you make as commission members? So there you go.
That's great. We're going to be done before 1, and that's what I promised the chairman. So we all keep our jobs this way. So just a quick policy update. We've spent the last 2 times, or yesterday and this morning, talking about policy issues. So just to recap for the record, the 8th edition sentencing guideline draft will be prepared for the December meeting. We'll provide it to all members prior to the meeting so that they can review it. And then the day before the December meeting, so that Wednesday, we will plan for an afternoon meeting from 1 to 5 so that there's an opportunity to review and vet or modify that so that we can consider it for approval for public hearings during the December business meeting. The 8th edition resentencing guidelines will sort of be done in the same fashion. We'll just look at some of the recommendations we've had, particularly about drug dependency and drug-related offenses, and try to make sure that we're capturing that in any kind of modifications to the resentencing guidelines to provide for you. State parole guidelines, we talked this morning about some brief changes, some technical changes, adding of definitions to what was published previously, and so those will be incorporated, submitted to the Pennsylvania Bulletin through publication, and then submitted to the General Assembly, and that will start at the 90-day review period, and we anticipate that those guidelines will take effect January 1st of next year, and we're working with the parole board on implementing that. The next is the state recommitment ranges, parole recommitment ranges. As I said, I'll be meeting with the parole board next month during their retreat to review those and to come up with recommendations for modified parole recommitment ranges and bring those to the commission for the December meeting. The one thing I'll take into account is we did receive public comment during public hearings about concerns about the recommitment ranges, so I'll try to address those and incorporate those into the draft we'll provide to you. And then the final thing is the pretrial domestic violence risk assessment tool. You may recall that a number of years ago, pre-COVID, we spent 2 years working on this and coming up with a model tool that we could recommend to the General Assembly and to county courts. And we made a decision as a commission about what that model tool was. It's called the DARA. But there were also some limitations or some other recommendations related to that review that we went through in terms of narrowing the focus of what is labeled as domestic violence. Intimate partner violence is much more in line with how these tools operate, and also suggestions about some changes to the legislation to help to promote a better ability to information and to do studies of outcomes for the use of the tool. But COVID disrupted a lot of this, and so just recently in the last couple of months, the chair and I reconnected with some with staff of the judiciary committees trying to get a better understanding of issues that we should be continuing to look at and any kind of mechanism for reporting this to the General Assembly. And so there were a couple of issues that were raised. One was that the commission should revisit this issue because some time has passed and try to see if there's any other research out there, particularly in the area of child abuse. So when you're thinking about domestic violence, we think about intimate partner violence, but there's also child abuse that could fall under the rubric of domestic violence. And so they ask us to at least look into that because there's a real concern about child sexual abuse and that we have enhancements for it. And so we agreed to sort of revisit this, spend a couple of months looking at things, and then compile a report with some recommendations that we can submit. And so we're targeting that towards the end of the year. I think, some time has passed, so they recognize that, nothing's going to happen right away. So if we don't get it in at the end of the year, we can do it, at the start of the session next year. But we'll continue to work on that and engage Brett and Matt in that. And then the final thing is regarding miscellaneous items, and it's about the upcoming meetings. During the December meeting, we developed a schedule for next year to publish our meetings moving forward. And so the sort of the pattern we've had in place is we meet in March, June, September, and December. It's usually a Wednesday, Thursday, and it usually is the first or second week of the month. So what I'll do is ask Kathy to do a doodle poll, get it out to everyone so that we have some sense of days that look generally good or bad for next year. And then we'll put together a proposed meeting agenda for a vote during the December meeting. So I ask, if nothing else, that you just respond to Kathy's doodle poll, and we'll try to find dates that work for everyone or almost everyone. And with that, I'll turn it back to the chair with great pride that it's not even 1:15 as we are done with everything.
All right.
Okay, I think we can still, I'm borrowing that time, and I think it's still under the deadline.
Well, is there anything else that anybody would like to add? Then we will stand adjourned until the December
7th policy meeting.
policy meeting. The date that we'll live in.
Yeah,
All right.
that's right. And we have lunch next door for everyone. Otherwise, safe travels. Thanks for coming to State College.
Congratulations, Judge Tucker.
Oh,
Judge Tucker,
yes, Judge Tucker,
I know Senator Street was saying something.
or Senator Street.
Center Street.
I just want to say congratulations to the judge on his retirement.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much.
You did a great job. We really appreciate your service.
Well, we'll see you around the state somewhere, certainly. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You are in.